Have you ever been told directly or indirectly that a seat wasn't meant for someone like you? Imagine walking onto a plane, holding a valid first-class ticket, only to be doubted, humiliated, and treated as though your very presence was a mistake. That's exactly what happened to Angela Carter, a respected black CEO and federal judge. But here's the question when stripped of dignity in front of strangers. Do you stay silent to avoid conflict? Or do you stand firm, knowing the cost may be even higher? As security officers walked down that narrow aisle, every passenger thought they knew what would happen next. What none of them expected was the salute, a gesture that would flip the entire moment on its head and expose a system built on bias. If it were you in that seat, how would you respond? Would you fight for just your place or for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong? Stay with us as we unfold a story not of outrage alone, but of resilience, justice, and transformation. And before we begin, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories that matter. The morning light spilled across Chicago, soft and golden, catching the glass facades of the Loop's tallest buildings. Angela Carter adjusted the pearl necklace around her neck as she stood by the hotel window, watching the city come alive below. The pearls were not about fashion. They were her mother's, worn at graduations, court appointments, and the day Angela signed the papers that made her the CEO of Metasphere Technologies. A small reminder of family, of grounding, of the dignity she carried everywhere she went. She breathed deeply, steadying herself. Today was not a day for sentiment, though. It was another day of responsibility, another day of proving that excellence had no color. Angela had been invited to Washington, D.C., to deliver a keynote on equity in the healthcare industry. Her presence mattered not just as a CEO, but also as a recently appointed federal judge. That duality carried weight, and as always, she intended to walk into the spotlight with calm precision, never arrogance. The black suit jacket hung crisply on her frame, tailored yet modest. A muted gray blouse peeked from underneath. Practical shoes, minimal makeup. She had learned long ago that confidence was not stitched into labels or designer purses. It came from how you carried yourself, from the steadiness of your gaze when people doubted you. Downstairs, a driver provided by Sky Continental Airways waited with a black sedan. It was a small courtesy, the airline's way of apologizing for a minor scheduling mix-up with her ticket earlier in the week. Angela accepted not out of necessity, but pragmatism. She appreciated efficiency, not flattery. The ride to O'Hare International Airport was quiet, the driver respectful after a brief greeting. Angela leaned back in the seat, eyes half closed, her mind sorting through the day ahead, the speech draft in her folder, the notes for her staff back at Metasphere, the docket waiting on her desk in Chicago when she returned. Always layers of responsibility, but she carried them with ease, as though they were threads woven into her being. At the terminal, she thanked the driver with a nod and stepped onto the sidewalk. O'Hare was its usual self, bustling, hurried, a microcosm of every story and every ambition converging in one space. She moved with practiced calm through the crowds, checked in swiftly, and approached the gate marked for Flight 482 to Washington, D.C. Her boarding pass read, Seat 2A, a first-class window seat. She smiled faintly. Window seats had always been her preference. She liked the quiet distance they provided, a chance to look out and think. When boarding began, Angela was among the first to approach. She handed her phone to the agent, who scanned her code with a beep. No issue. She walked the jet bridge, rolling her carry-on beside her, calm as always. And then, as she stepped into the aircraft, it began. A tall woman with sharp cheekbones and perfectly styled blonde hair blocked the aisle just a few steps inside the cabin. The crisp Navy uniform of a lead flight attendant clung to her with authority. A gold nameplate read, "Catherine Hayes." "Excuse me, ma'am," Catherine said, her voice polite on the surface but edged with skepticism. "This is the first-class cabin. May I see your boarding pass again?" Angela offered it with the same calmness she had carried since morning. "Of course." Catherine glanced at the screen, then back at Angela. Her lips tightened. "I believe there's been a mistake. This seat isn't meant for people like—" She stopped herself, the words hanging heavy in the air, but the implication was clear. Angela felt it. Not the first time, not the second. It was a familiar sting she had known since childhood, dressed in new uniforms but never truly gone. She kept her voice measured. "The boarding agent scanned me through. It says, Seat 2A. Catherine's tone hardened, as if Angela's composure annoyed her. "I'll need to verify this with the captain. Please step aside. We'll seat you in coach for now." Angela didn't move. She stood with quiet firmness, her carry-on still by her side, behind her. A few passengers in line shifted uncomfortably. A man in a gray business suit muttered, "Holding everyone up." Another woman whispered, "Why is she making a fuss?" Angela inhaled slowly. Her heart ached, not from embarrassment, but from the weight of déjà vu. A voice inside whispered, "How many times must you prove that you belong?" Years ago, as a teenager, she had been asked to leave a boutique store because the clerk assumed she wasn't a customer. She remembered standing outside on the sidewalk, fighting back tears, vowing she would rise so high that no one could ever question her place again. And here, decades later, pearls around her neck, a federal title attached to her name. She was being told yet again, "You don't belong here." Catherine gestured toward the back. "Ma'am, we need to keep boarding moving. Seat 26B is available." Angela stayed still. "My seat is 2A. I'll wait here until it's clarified." The tension thickened. Other flight attendants looked over, uncertain. A younger one, Luis Moreno, badge slightly crooked, no more than mid-20s, hesitated near the galley. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but Catherine's sharp glance silenced him. Passengers filing in now craned their necks, some whispering, others pulling out their phones. Angela could feel the eyes on her, some sympathetic, most indifferent, a few quietly annoyed. The social script was playing out a black woman accused of reaching above her station, expected to step back quietly. Captain Robert Whitfield soon emerged from the cockpit, his shoulders squared, authority stitched into his uniform. Catherine leaned in, whispering, pointing toward Angela. His eyes scanned her once, then her phone screen. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "there appears to be a manifest error. This seat is not assigned to you. Please take the economy seat until we sort this out." Angela's fingers tightened on the handle of her bag. Inside, a storm of emotions churned: frustration, fatigue, the sting of recognition. She wanted to shout, to call out the injustice in front of everyone. But she also knew the power of restraint, the gravity of her position. Her voice stayed even. "Captain, my boarding pass clearly states 2A. Please confirm with the gate before asking me to move." Whitfield frowned. "If you don't comply, I'll have to call security." The words dropped like a hammer. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. A man seated in 3C smirked, shaking his head as if to say, she should just know her place. Angela's chest rose and fell slowly. She thought of her staff at Metasphere, of the young clerks at the courthouse who looked up to her, of her nieces who wore T-shirts that said, "Future Judge." She thought of the people who had whispered to her over the years, "We're proud of you. You make us believe we belong, too. She couldn't back down now, but as the captain turned toward the intercom to summon airport security, Angela closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. Lord, give me patience and strength. Let this not just be about me, but about everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. The hum of the cabin grew louder, restless, phones tilted for video. The air grew heavy with anticipation. Everyone expected the same scene they had watched in viral clips before a passenger dragged out, humiliated, powerless. What they didn't expect was what would happen next. The captain's words lingered in the air like a warning siren. Passengers stilled, their conversations fading into a low hum of curiosity. Angela Carter remained where she was, her carry-on at her side, her gaze steady. Inside, however, a familiar heaviness pressed on her chest. She had endured slights before cold stares in boardrooms, doubting questions from colleagues who underestimated her, but rarely in such a public and humiliating stage as this. Catherine Hayes folded her arms tightly, lips pressed thin. Ma'am, you're holding up boarding. Please move to the back before this escalates. Angela inhaled slowly, choosing her words with care. This isn't about a boarding delay. It's about dignity. I have a valid first-class ticket. I will remain here until the mistake is corrected. The murmurs behind her swelled. A man in line shifted impatiently, glancing at his watch. Unbelievable, he muttered. People always looking for trouble. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to sting. Angela's eyes flicked toward him briefly, then back to the captain. She thought of her nieces again, the young girls who believed the world was opening for them. She would not model surrender. Captain Whitfield's jaw tightened. Security will resolve this. He gestured to Catherine, who gave a satisfied nod and moved toward the intercom. Luis Moreno stood frozen in the galley, conflict etched across his face. He wanted to speak. Angela could see it in his trembling jaw, but fear tethered him. His badge said, trainee. Challenging the lead attendant might cost him his job. Angela caught his eye briefly and offered the smallest nod, as if to say, I see you, I understand. Catherine's voice carried over the cabin speakers. Security to Flight 482 at Gate C-17. Immediate assistance requested. The cabin erupted into hushed conversations. Phones tilted higher, recording discreetly. Passengers leaned into the aisle for a better view. The stage had been set for the spectacle they expected. A passenger, black, firm, unapologetic, marched off the aircraft. Angela's pulse quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. She had learned in courtrooms that silence and composure could hold more power than a raised voice. Still, a small tremor of pain whispered through her, why does it always come to this? She glanced at the window seat just feet away, 2A. Her rightful place, empty, waiting. Such a small thing, a square of leather and cushion, yet symbolic of battles spanning centuries. A woman seated in 1C, dressed in pearls and a pale pink blazer, leaned over with a disapproving scowl. Why don't you just sit where they ask? You're making it difficult for everyone. Angela met her eyes calmly. Respect isn't difficult. It's fundamental. The woman sniffed, turning away, muttering something Angela couldn't hear. Minutes stretched thin. The jet bridge door opened again, and the sound of heavy boots approached. 3 uniformed airport security officers stepped onto the plane, radios at their shoulders, belts heavy with equipment. The atmosphere shifted instantly, anticipation, fear, judgment, all thickening at once. Passengers straightened in their seats, phones poised. Angela kept her eyes steady, bracing for the indignity of being escorted out, yet somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice reminded her, you've faced worse. You carry truth. You carry authority, even if they can't see it yet. Catherine stepped forward quickly, pointing at Angela with a rigid finger. That's her. She refuses to move from the first-class cabin. She doesn't belong here. The words struck hard. Not she refused to move to coach. Not there's a ticketing error. But she doesn't belong here. Angela's throat tightened, though her expression didn't falter. Behind her calm exterior, an echo of childhood pain surfaced the time her high school teacher had pulled her aside after class and said, "You're bright, Angela, but don't set your sights too high. People like you rarely make it that far." The lead officer, broad-shouldered and stern, stepped closer. For a moment, silence consumed the cabin. Every eye was on him, every phone lens tilted. Catherine folded her arms in expectation, waiting for the humiliating removal. The officer stopped directly before Angela. He looked down at the boarding pass still clutched in her hand, then lifted his gaze to her face. Recognition dawned. His spine straightened abruptly. "Judge Carter," he said, voice steady but edged with respect. And then, to the shock of everyone watching, he raised his hand in a crisp salute. The other two officers followed instantly, boots clicking, right hands to brows. "Good afternoon, Your Honor." The cabin gasped. Passengers froze mid-breath. Catherine's jaw fell slack, her authority collapsing in an instant. Captain Whitfield blinked, color draining from his face. Phones trembled as they continued recording, capturing every angle of the moment. Angela did not smile. She inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, her dignity intact, her presence commanding without a word. Inside, however, her heart ached not from vindication, but from the cruel necessity of titles and uniforms to secure the respect every passenger deserved. The officer lowered his hand. "Apologies for the disruption. Judge, we'll ensure you're seated properly." Angela's voice, calm and resonant, carried through the stunned cabin. "Thank you. Officer, my boarding pass says 2A. That's where I'll sit." The officer turned sharply to Catherine. "Is there a problem here?" Catherine stammered, words tripping over themselves. I was only following procedure." "I didn't realize she was a judge," the officer cut in, voice cold. "Or didn't realize she was a person with the right to sit where her ticket says." A ripple of discomfort spread through the cabin. Passengers glanced at one another, some ashamed, some defensive, some shaken from their complacency. Angela moved toward 2A, finally setting her carry-on into the overhead bin. She lowered herself into the seat with unhurried grace, the pearls at her neck glinting in the cabin light. As she settled, she thought not of triumph, but of the countless others who had no security salute to shield them, those who had been dismissed, humiliated, quietly erased from spaces they had earned. Her eyes drifted to the young flight attendant, Luis Moreno, still rooted near the galley. He looked at her with wide, conflicted eyes, as though torn between relief and guilt. Angela gave him a small nod once more. "Your courage will matter someday," the gesture seemed to say. The intercom crackled. Captain Whitfield's voice, forced and tight, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. Please take your seats so we may depart shortly." But the tone of his words carried no authority now, not after what everyone had just witnessed. Angela rested her hands on her lap, her heartbeat steadying. She looked out the small oval window at the tarmac beyond. The sun had shifted higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the concrete. This was more than a misunderstanding. It was a mirror, a reflection of systems built on assumptions, reinforced by silence, only challenged when someone refused to step aside. For Angela Carter, this battle was not just for herself, it was for every person who had been told, in words subtle or blunt, "This seat isn't meant for you." And as the engines hummed awake, She knew the story was only beginning. The plane finally pushed back from Gate C-17 engines, roaring to life. Angela Carter sat upright, hands folded neatly in her lap, the hum of the cabin a distant background to the storm of thoughts in her mind. She wasn't used to public confrontations, but she had learned long ago that power often arrived in the quietest of forms: composure, clarity, and moral certainty. Luis Moreno approached cautiously. Clipboard in hand, "Judge Carter, I just wanted to say thank you for standing up, for not giving in." Angela gave him a brief smile, small but sincere. "It's not just for me. It's for everyone who deserves respect." Luis nodded, eyes bright but haunted. He had seen how easily people could be silenced by authority. He had been tempted to follow the lead of Catherine Hayes, to let protocol override conscience, but something about Angela's presence had broken that spell. In the cockpit, Captain Whitfield sat rigid, hands gripping the yoke. His mind replayed the events repeatedly: the salute, the crisp acknowledgement, the wave of authority that required no words. He felt the weight of decades of assumed competence crashing against the reality of complicity. He hadn't intended harm. He had simply trusted the system, trusted the lead attendant, trusted that his judgment alone was enough. And yet, for the first time, he realized how wrong that assumption had been. There were reports he had dismissed over the years, complaints he had filed away without thought, patterns he had failed to notice because they didn't affect him personally. The grounding was inevitable. The internal investigation would be swift and public. But it wasn't the grounding that frightened him. It was the understanding that he had enabled injustice through inaction. Back in the cabin, murmurs had settled into an uneasy silence. Passengers, still clutching phones, whispered to one another. The air carried a mix of awe, confusion, and self-reflection. Angela noticed a young woman near the rear glance at her, eyes wide, a notebook open in her lap. She was recording details, perhaps planning to tell someone, perhaps just absorbing the scene as evidence of the subtle, systemic barriers that existed even in spaces meant for comfort and leisure. Catherine Hayes, meanwhile, stood near the service cart, frozen. Her authority had evaporated the instant the officers recognized Angela. She tried to regain composure, straightening her blazer, but the cabin had already marked her as complicit. Her mind raced. How would she explain this to her superiors? What would happen to her career, now intertwined with a viral moment that had unfolded on social media? In real time, Angela took a deep breath, allowing herself a small reflection. She thought about the countless times she had faced assumptions about her capabilities, the looks in boardrooms when she entered, the subtle dismissals, the outright refusals to acknowledge her expertise. Yet she also remembered the mentors who had believed in her, the friends who had stood by her when no one else would. Today, all of those lessons had crystallized into a single principle: dignity was not optional. Respect was non-negotiable. Luis Moreno, still near the galley, swallowed nervously. I didn't speak up before, even when I saw things that were wrong. But I won't let fear stop me anymore. I want to help." Angela nodded, letting the smallest hint of encouragement show. "That's a start. Courage is a muscle. You strengthen it by using it." As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Angela's phone vibrated. A message from her clerk at the courthouse media are reporting the incident. Video circulating. Reaction strong. Press conference scheduled if needed. She ignored it for now, focusing on the moment, letting the gravity of what had just occurred settle. Captain Whitfield finally broke the silence in the cockpit. "We need to prepare a statement. Internal review, immediate training updates. This cannot happen again." His co-pilot nodded, eyes wide, voice quiet. "Yes, sir, I understand." Angela's gaze drifted back to Luis, seeing potential where others saw compliance. She realized that systemic change required more than top-down decrees. It required people within the system willing to speak up, willing to act when no one else would. Luis had that potential, and she made a mental note to ensure he had a role in shaping the airline's cultural reform. The rest of the flight passed in a tense, almost surreal quiet. Passengers remained mostly in their seats, occasionally glancing toward Angela, some whispering to neighbors about the unprecedented event. No one attempted to speak over her. The respect she commanded was not derived from her title alone, but from the way she carried herself in the face of injustice. Upon landing at Washington, D.C., airport staff and additional security were already waiting. Angela rose, walking toward the jet bridge with measured steps. Luis trailed a few paces behind, his presence unnoticed by most, but crucial to the unfolding chain of events. Captain Whitfield followed, hands folded, silent, processing the morning's revelations. As they reached the terminal, cameras from the media swarmed, flashes igniting as reporters scrambled for position. Angela, ever composed, continued forward without pause. Luis adjusted his tie nervously, but when Angela gave him a brief nod, he straightened, feeling a flicker of purpose and responsibility. A federal officer greeted Angela at the base of the jet bridge. "Judge Carter, we'll escort you to the secure entrance." "Is everything all right?" "Yes," she replied softly, but her eyes swept the terminal, taking in the passengers who had witnessed the event. She thought about the conversations that would follow, the social media reactions, the potential backlash, and knew that real change required more than a single viral moment. Captain Whitfield approached quietly. "Ma'am, I need to apologize, not for following procedure, but for failing to see the problem sooner." Angela's expression softened, though remained firm. Acknowledging the failure is the first step. Understanding it fully is what will prevent it from happening again. Luis, now a few steps behind, felt a surge of determination. He had been silent for too long, complicit in small ways. But Angela's presence had illuminated a path forward, a path where courage, even in quiet forms, could spark systemic reform. In the weeks that followed, Sky Continental Airways initiated a full review. Catherine Hayes was placed on administrative leave pending further inquiry. Training programs were overhauled, led by experts in civil rights, implicit bias, and ethical leadership. Discrimination complaint procedures were restructured with external oversight. The airline committed to public transparency, sharing progress reports and metrics with passengers, employees, and the industry. Angela's role became pivotal not through lawsuits, not through demands, but through direct engagement with the airline's leadership. She consulted on training scenarios, helped craft policies, and mentored employees like Luis, emphasizing that accountability was more than a procedural requirement, it was a moral imperative. Luis found himself leading workshops, using his experience from that day as a case study. Employees initially skeptical of his authority gradually recognized the authenticity of his perspective. He spoke not as an enforcer, but as someone who had learned through failure, someone who had witnessed injustice firsthand and was committed to creating change. Captain Whitfield attended retraining sessions alongside his crew, confronting the biases he hadn't recognized and the assumptions he had allowed to persist. He faced uncomfortable truths, the knowledge that his inaction had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. When he finally returned to command, he did so not with arrogance, but with humility, understanding that authority was inseparable from responsibility. Angela, meanwhile, returned to her judicial duties, bringing the lessons of the airline incident into her broader work. She incorporated discussions on systemic bias, equity, and dignity into her courtroom ethos. Her influence extended beyond individual rulings, shaping colleagues and younger attorneys to recognize the importance of fairness and empathy. The viral videos, the public outrage, the media frenzy, they faded in time. What remained was a culture gradually shifting, guided by the principle Angela had embodied that day: dignity is universal, respect is non-negotiable, and courage quiet. Steadfast courage can spark change in even the most rigid systems. The weeks after the incident unfolded like a carefully orchestrated storm. Angela Carter's phone never stopped buzzing. Messages from journalists, colleagues, civil rights organizations, and concerned passengers poured in. Yet she did not answer them immediately. Instead, she focused on what mattered most, ensuring that Sky Continental Airways would commit to change in a way that went beyond optics. Luis Moreno was the first to arrive at the airline's corporate office the morning after the flight. He walked through the polished hallways, nervous but determined. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, yet he felt a spark of purpose he had never experienced. The invitation to participate in reform was unprecedented for someone at his level, but he understood that his perspective, grounded in lived experience, was precisely what the company needed. Angela arrived shortly after, moving through the office with calm assurance. She greeted a few familiar faces and then entered the main conference room, where Catherine Hayes had been called in for an initial debrief. Catherine's posture was rigid, her face pale, betraying a mixture of anger, fear, and disbelief. The room was stark, fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished table, emphasizing the tension in the air. "Good morning," Angela began, her voice steady but commanding attention. "We're here to ensure that the events of Flight 482 are understood, analyzed, and prevented from happening again. This is not about punishment alone. This is about transformation." Catherine flinched slightly at Angela's calm authority, used to commanding compliance rather than being held accountable. I understand," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Angela looked at her without judgment, yet firmly. Understanding the problem is only the first step. Acknowledging the impact of your actions and committing to change is what makes a difference. The airline has agreed to comprehensive reforms, and you will be part of that process if you choose to participate meaningfully. Otherwise, consequences will follow. The words hung in the air like an unspoken ultimatum. Catherine's internal defenses wavered. For years, she had justified her actions under the guise of protocol and standards. But Angela's presence stripped away those excuses. Every passenger's dignity she had compromised now became a tangible weight pressing on her conscience. Luis shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two. He had always followed procedure, never daring to challenge authority. But today he realized that complicity was not neutrality, it was participation in harm. Angela's calm presence was both comforting and unsettling. It demanded reflection and courage simultaneously. Over the next few days, Angela worked closely with the airline's leadership team. She led workshops on implicit bias, emphasizing real-world scenarios rather than abstract concepts. Flight attendants practiced responding to subtle forms of discrimination, role-playing tense situations with passengers, and navigating complex social cues that could easily be misinterpreted as compliance or defiance. The training sessions were intense. Employees who had once assumed that appearances alone dictated authority were confronted with situations where empathy and observation were paramount. Angela encouraged open dialogue, asking questions that prompted introspection. How might unconscious bias affect your judgment? What assumptions are you making without evidence? Whose dignity might you be compromising without realizing it? Captain Whitfield attended these sessions alongside his crew. Initially defensive, He struggled with the realization that decades of experience did not immunize him from moral failure. He had believed that following protocol equaled ethical behavior, but Angela's guidance revealed a deeper responsibility safeguarding dignity, even when uncomfortable or inconvenient. Luis Moreno emerged as an unexpected leader, his willingness to share personal experiences. The moments he had observed, yet remained silent, created a culture of accountability. Colleagues, initially skeptical of his authority, began to recognize the value of honesty and vulnerability in creating change. He became a bridge between management and staff, helping to ensure that lessons learned were internalized, not just documented in policy manuals. Meanwhile, Angela began coordinating with external consultants specializing in civil rights and aviation ethics. Together, they conducted a thorough audit of Sky Continental's policies and procedures. They identified practices that, while operationally efficient, enabled discriminatory behavior to persist, discretionary authority in first-class seating, ambiguous reporting protocols, and subjective criteria for passenger handling. Recommendations were implemented swiftly. A new system categorized complaints based on severity and type, ensuring that bias-related incidents were addressed with urgency and transparency. Employees could report concerns anonymously, bypassing traditional hierarchies to reach senior management directly. Quarterly audits assessed passenger experiences across demographic lines, providing actionable data to prevent recurrence. Angela also proposed the creation of the Carter Aviation Equity Fund, an initiative dedicated to supporting minority students pursuing careers in aviation. The fund would provide scholarships for pilot training, aircraft maintenance programs, and aviation management degrees. The airline pledged a $5 million endowment, demonstrating that addressing systemic inequity required tangible investment, not symbolic gestures. The impact of these measures was immediate and measurable. Within the first 6 months, discrimination complaints decreased by over 70%. Employee satisfaction surveys reflected heightened engagement and trust, particularly among staff from marginalized backgrounds. Passengers noticed the difference interactions were more professional, respectful, and equitable, regardless of class, race, or gender. In the midst of these organizational changes, Angela returned to her judicial duties. She carried the lessons of Flight 482 into her courtroom, subtly weaving discussions of bias, empathy, and procedural fairness into her interactions. Her colleagues observed a shift in her demeanor, not in authority, but in the depth of her engagement with issues of equity. Her presence became a quiet reminder that systemic change could be catalyzed by personal action grounded in integrity. Captain Whitfield, now deeply reflective, committed himself to ongoing learning. He enrolled in courses on civil rights, historical context of discrimination, and ethical leadership. When he resumed command, it was with humility and awareness that every passenger, regardless of background, deserved dignity and protection. His crew noticed the difference. Younger attendants began approaching him for guidance on handling complex interpersonal dynamics. Luis Moreno's trajectory transformed as well. He was appointed Sky Continental's first cabin culture specialist, tasked with integrating equity principles into everyday operations. He led workshops, coached peers, and monitored compliance with the new systems. Each success, each story of crew members intervening to prevent discrimination became a testament to the ripple effect of moral courage. Catherine Hayes, though initially resistant, participated in retraining sessions under Angela's oversight. She confronted uncomfortable truths about her assumptions and past behaviors. The process was slow and painful, but over time she began to understand the human cost of unexamined biases. Angela's approach was firm but compassionate accountability intertwined with opportunities for growth. As months passed, the airline culture shifted. Policies became living documents, continually reviewed and updated. Passengers noticed a measurable improvement in service quality, particularly among diverse groups who had previously felt marginalized. Media coverage shifted from scandal to recognition, highlighting Sky Continental's transformation as an industry benchmark for inclusivity. Angela reflected quietly one evening, reviewing feedback from employees and passengers. The change was not complete, and it never would be. Human systems are inherently imperfect, but the trajectory was clear. Courage, integrity, and commitment to dignity could catalyze systemic transformation. She understood that a single incident could ignite widespread reform when approached with clarity, resolve, and empathy. Louise approached her after a training session, eyes shining with purpose. "Judge Carter, I didn't know I could make a difference. Now, I feel like I finally can." Angela smiled faintly, the warmth of acknowledgement in her gaze. The difference is made by those willing to act when no one else will. Keep that commitment. It will ripple further than you imagine. And in that moment, she realized that the real victory of Flight 482 was not the viral attention or the immediate corrective actions. It was the creation of a culture where dignity was foundational, where each individual, regardless of role or rank, understood the power and responsibility inherent in ethical action. The story of Flight 482 had spread far beyond the confines of Sky Continental Airways. Social media posts, initially shared by passengers and eyewitnesses, had gone viral. News outlets dissected every detail, highlighting Angela Carter's calm and commanding presence, and the abrupt, humiliating mistakes of the airline staff. But Angela did not seek attention. Her focus remained steadfast on meaningful change, not headlines. At the airline's headquarters in downtown Chicago, Catherine Hayes sat in a meeting room reviewing her retraining curriculum. She no longer approached the work with defensiveness or irritation. Instead, she listened to the insights shared by Luis Moreno, reflecting on his experiences and realizing that her prior actions had consequences she could no longer ignore. She admitted to herself, quietly, that for years she had relied on her position to justify behaviors that were, at times, discriminatory. Meanwhile, Robert Whitfield spent his evenings immersed in courses on civil rights history and leadership ethics. The grounding period had initially felt punitive, but he soon came to understand that the discomfort was a mirror reflecting his unexamined biases. He began to see patterns in his past behavior, the subtle ways he had dismissed complaints, the assumptions he made about passengers based on appearance, and the ease with which he had trusted authority without scrutiny. The lessons were difficult, but transformative. Angela's office became a hub of organized, deliberate change. She met with department heads to discuss the implementation of the newly developed Dignity First program, which included a confidential reporting system accessible to every employee. The system bypassed traditional hierarchies, sending discrimination reports directly to senior management and external oversight committees. Each report now demanded acknowledgement, investigation, and actionable follow-up. Luis Moreno was at the forefront of these efforts. He led workshops for flight attendants and cabin crews, creating role-play scenarios that were realistic, challenging, and emotionally charged. Employees were encouraged to think critically, question assumptions, and speak up when witnessing bias. These exercises were uncomfortable, at times triggering strong emotional reactions, but the discomfort was intentional. It was the first step toward internalizing the importance of empathy and vigilance. Catherine Hayes found herself in a difficult position. For decades, she had defined her professionalism by adherence to rigid standards and unquestioning authority. Now, she was being asked to embrace reflection and moral responsibility. During one particularly tense session, She faced a scenario where she had to navigate a passenger dispute while correcting a biased colleague in real time. For the first time, she realized that her past reliance on rules and hierarchy had caused harm. The airline's leadership, including CEO Martin Reynolds and Executive VP Eleanor Shaw, were actively involved. They understood that a superficial apology or a temporary PR campaign would not suffice. Sky Continental's survival and its reputation depended on systemic reform. The company allocated significant resources for independent audits, new training programs, and ongoing monitoring of equity-related outcomes. Public reporting of progress became mandatory, with transparency metrics visible to passengers and stakeholders alike. Angela remained a constant presence, balancing her judicial responsibilities with her role as a catalyst for reform. Her approach was methodical. She emphasized structural changes, demanded accountability, and modeled dignity in every interaction. She held sessions with airline staff to discuss microaggressions, bias in decision-making, and the power dynamics inherent in passenger interactions. Staff members were encouraged to share personal experiences, fostering an environment of openness and mutual learning. The industry took notice. Competitor airlines, initially critical of Sky Continental's scandal, began re-evaluating their own practices. Industry publications, which had once reported the incident with a sensationalist lens, now highlighted the airline's reform efforts as a model. Articles featured interviews with Angela, Luis, and even Robert Whitfield, showcasing the journey from failure to accountability. The conversation shifted from scandal to transformation, highlighting the power of leadership to effect real, lasting change. Back in Chicago, Angela prepared for her keynote at the National Judicial Conference. She planned to share insights from Flight 482 without sensationalizing the personal attacks she endured. Instead, she focused on systemic lessons, how unconscious bias operates in institutional settings, the importance of accountability, and the moral imperative to protect human dignity in every professional interaction. The night before the conference, Angela reflected on the journey. She remembered sitting in first class that day, the tension, the subtle indignities, and the disbelief that anyone could question her right to occupy that space. She recalled the fear and uncertainty of witnessing a system failing to safeguard human dignity. But she also remembered the moments of integrity, Luis Moreno standing firm, her own calm persistence, and the eventual acknowledgement by airline leadership that change was necessary. Catherine Hayes had her own moments of reflection. She found herself walking through the airport after a training session, observing passengers and crews, and thinking about how small, everyday decisions can either uphold or violate dignity. For the first time, she recognized that professionalism is inseparable from ethical responsibility. She began journaling, documenting situations where she might intervene differently, reinforcing the lessons of accountability she was now committed to living by. Robert Whitfield, now flying domestic routes as a first officer, embraced his role as a mentor. He spoke candidly with junior flight attendants, sharing his past mistakes and the insights he had gained. His humility and transparency were unusual in the cockpit, but his crew appreciated the depth of his reflections. He emphasized that true leadership is measured not by authority, but by the respect and protection one provides to everyone on board. Luis Moreno's role evolved into one of significant influence. He traveled between Sky Continental hubs, conducting workshops, and meeting with crew members from diverse backgrounds. His personal story, the fear, hesitation, and eventual courage to speak up resonated deeply. Staff members began to approach him with concerns, suggestions, and confessions. Through his guidance, the airline fostered a culture in which dignity was prioritized, and employees understood that ethical action was valued above rigid compliance. Public recognition grew, but Angela remained focused on substance over spectacle. She noted the changes, the reduction in complaints, and the improved morale among staff. But she also recognized that true transformation required sustained vigilance. Bias could not be eradicated entirely, but systems could be structured to minimize harm, provide accountability, and cultivate awareness. One morning, Angela boarded another Sky Continental flight, this time from Chicago to Washington, D.C., to attend a legal seminar. She was greeted warmly by a diverse crew led by a black woman captain. Luis Moreno was among the attendants, now confident and self-assured, guiding passengers and monitoring interactions with care. The flight proceeded smoothly, marked by professionalism and respect, a stark contrast to Flight 482. As Angela settled into her seat, she noticed an elderly passenger leaning toward her. "Aren't you the judge from that incident last year?" the woman asked softly. Angela nodded. "My grandson is part of the Carter Aviation Equity Fund. He's training to become a pilot because of what you inspired." The words resonated deeply. Angela realized that the ripple effects of Flight 482 extended far beyond one flight or one airline. Systemic change, once catalyzed by courage and integrity, could alter individual lives and influence an entire industry. The moment reinforced the principle she had championed all along: dignity, respect, and accountability matter. Always. Months after Flight 482, Sky Continental Airways had begun to feel markedly different. The tangible evidence of change, the Dignity First program, anonymous reporting systems, and extensive staff retraining was visible in every hub and on every flight. Employees who had once quietly tolerated bias now spoke openly, and the culture of deference to rank over humanity began to dissolve. Luis Moreno walked the aisles of a bustling Chicago-bound flight, observing interactions with a critical yet compassionate eye. He noticed a nervous young flight attendant hesitating as a passenger asked for a seat change. Luis intervened quietly, guiding her on how to handle the situation with respect while adhering to airline protocols. The young attendant's relief was palpable. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice tinged with awe. Luis smiled, thinking back to how he had once hesitated to speak up for Angela Carter, and the power of courage and ethical action became vividly real to him. Catherine Hayes, meanwhile, had embraced a new perspective on leadership. She conducted her training sessions with authenticity, incorporating real-life examples from past incidents. Staff members, initially resistant, began sharing their own experiences of witnessing bias. Catherine listened attentively, guiding them through reflection exercises. And gradually, she sensed the genuine shifts in attitudes. She realized that transformation wasn't instantaneous. It was a process, often messy and uncomfortable, but profoundly meaningful. Angela Carter's judicial duties continued, but her evenings were increasingly occupied by consulting with Sky Continental's leadership team. She provided guidance on policy, ethics, and crisis management. Every decision she influenced was grounded in the principle that dignity was non-negotiable. She often reflected on the irony as a federal judge. She presided over legal disputes, yet her most significant influence had come from an airline seat dispute that revealed systemic inequities. Robert Whitfield's journey had been equally transformative. Having returned to domestic roots as a first officer, he no longer considered himself untouchable by authority or immune to moral responsibility. He actively participated in workshops, sharing his story candidly with junior crew members. "I failed passengers by trusting assumptions over evidence," he admitted during one session. "But I'm learning to correct that. Leadership isn't about being right. It's about doing right." His humility and openness created an atmosphere where younger staff felt safe acknowledging their own mistakes. Angela received updates from the External Oversight Committee monitoring Sky Continental's reforms. Discrimination complaints had decreased sharply. Passenger satisfaction scores rose, and staff engagement metrics reflected a more inclusive and conscientious work environment. Yet, Angela knew these numbers were only a part of the story. The true measure of success was cultural, the subtle shifts in behavior, empathy, and moral accountability that data alone could not capture. One evening, Angela reflected on the small, personal victories that often went unnoticed. A junior flight attendant had recently shared a story of intervening when a senior crew member questioned a passenger's loyalty status, applying bias. The situation was resolved respectfully, and the attendant credited the Dignity First program for empowering her. Moments like these, quiet but impactful, reassured Angela that the change was embedding itself in the organization's fabric. Catherine Hayes encountered a challenging situation mid-flight. A passenger insisted that a black family seated in premium economy had purchased the wrong tickets. Memories of past incidents crept into her mind, the judgmental stares, the assumptions she had once tolerated, the discomfort she had ignored. Drawing on her training and personal reflection, she addressed the situation calmly and empathetically. She verified the tickets without bias, explained the airline's procedures clearly, and ensured the family was treated with respect. The tension dissolved, and she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Luis Moreno noticed Robert Whitfield in the galley, quietly mentoring a new first officer. He smiled, recognizing the growth in a man who had once dismissed complaints and adhered unthinkingly to hierarchy. The first officer asked questions, reflecting on past decisions and seeking guidance on ethical judgment. Whitfield's patience and candor marked a stark contrast to his former demeanor. Transformation, Luis realized, was not about perfection. It was about commitment to continual self-awareness and improvement. Angela's influence extended beyond Sky Continental. She was invited to speak at aviation conferences, law schools, and industry panels. Her message was simple but profound. Institutions must recognize systemic biases, hold individuals accountable, and empower ethical action at every level. She emphasized the ripple effect of small acts of courage, reminding audiences that integrity often begins in moments that seem inconsequential at the time, yet accumulate into cultural change. One morning at O'Hare International, Angela boarded a flight to New York. The cabin crew greeted her warmly, a diverse team reflecting the airline's commitment to inclusion. Luis Moreno was present, confidently guiding passengers. Robert Whitfield was the first officer, attentive and engaged. The atmosphere felt markedly different from that fateful day months earlier. Angela felt a quiet satisfaction, recognizing that her insistence on accountability and dignity had reshaped the airline's culture. During the flight, an elderly passenger approached Angela. "Aren't you the judge who challenged Sky Continental last year?" she asked. Angela nodded. "Yes," she replied softly. The woman smiled. "My grandson is now in the Carter Aviation Equity Fund. He's training to become a pilot. Your courage changed his life." Angela's eyes welled with tears, touched by the tangible outcomes of her efforts. She realized that transformation was not only systemic, it was profoundly personal, affecting lives in ways she could not have anticipated. Meanwhile, Catherine Hayes received letters from passengers expressing gratitude for the respectful treatment they now consistently received. Luis Moreno kept meticulous records of incidents where staff intervened to prevent discrimination. Each report reinforced the power of the program and validated the hours of training, discussion, and reflection that had gone into cultivating a culture of respect. Sky Continental's success began to influence the broader airline industry. Competitors examined the airline's reforms, realizing that ethical responsibility and passenger satisfaction were intertwined. Best practices were shared at industry summits, and the Carter Aviation Equity Fund gained attention as a model for fostering diversity in aviation careers. Angela's vision had not only transformed one airline, but sparked conversations about equity and dignity across the sector. Back in her office, Angela reviewed the latest progress report. Complaints had fallen dramatically. Staff engagement surveys showed higher trust in leadership, and passenger satisfaction scores across all demographics had improved. Yet she remained cautious, knowing that true cultural transformation required ongoing vigilance. Systems could enforce policies, but the human element, empathy, courage, and self-reflection remained the ultimate safeguard against bias. That evening, Angela reflected on her journey. She remembered the tension in first class that day, the subtle indignities, and the disbelief that anyone could question her right to occupy that seat. She recalled Luis Moreno's courage, the accountability demanded from Robert Whitfield, and the airline leadership's eventual acknowledgement that change was imperative. She realized that dignity, once championed with calm persistence, could ripple outward, reshaping institutions and touching countless lives. The following months were a crucible for Sky Continental Airways. Executive meetings that had once focused narrowly on quarterly earnings now began with a review of the Dignity First program metrics. Martin Reynolds, the CEO, and Eleanor Shaw, the Executive VP, were deeply involved in monitoring progress. No longer were these discussions perfunctory. The stakes were moral as well as financial. Angela Carter continued to serve as an unofficial consultant, providing guidance on difficult personnel decisions and the development of new training modules. Her presence reminded the airline that the pursuit of equity required constant vigilance. Metrics matter, but so does the human heart. She would remind the leadership team, you can track compliance, but you can't track courage unless you nurture it. Luis Moreno thrived in his role as cabin culture specialist. He designed workshops that simulated real in-flight situations, prompting attendants to make judgment calls on seating assignments, customer complaints, and conflict resolution. In one session, a scenario involved a VIP passenger being rude and attempting to bypass protocols. The attendants had to respond with authority and empathy simultaneously. The exercises were rigorous, uncomfortable at times, but highly effective. Participants left with a heightened awareness of bias in themselves and others. Catherine Hayes took pride in mentoring new flight attendants. She often recounted the Flight 482 incident, emphasizing that recognizing bias was only the first step. Acting on it responsibly was the true measure of professionalism. Young attendants responded positively, inspired by her calm yet assertive guidance. Many reported feeling more confident in addressing difficult passenger interactions without fear of retaliation or criticism. Robert Whitfield's return to command was deliberate and carefully monitored. His first assignments were short domestic routes, paired with a mentor observer. He was tasked with applying the Dignity First principles actively, not just modeling them verbally. He spent hours reviewing passenger feedback, crew reports, and even flight recordings to identify situations where bias could have been minimized or prevented. His humility and thoroughness made a noticeable impression on colleagues, some of whom had initially doubted his commitment to change. Angela observed the cumulative effects of the reforms. Complaints involving discriminatory behavior had plummeted by 78% in the first year. But she knew numbers only told part of the story. She received letters and emails from passengers expressing genuine gratitude for feeling respected and safe. Stories poured in from families who had previously avoided air travel due to repeated indignities. One father recounted his teenage daughter's excitement at being treated with dignity during a flight, noting how it influenced her perception of authority and fairness. In the offices of Sky Continental's leadership, Eleanor Shaw examined monthly reports that highlighted trends in crew conduct, passenger complaints, and training engagement. She noted a clear pattern when attendants were empowered and given tools to intervene appropriately. Incidents of bias decreased dramatically. "The culture shift is tangible," she remarked to Martin Reynolds. "We're seeing it in behavior, not just compliance metrics." Angela's influence extended to the scholarship initiative. The Carter Aviation Equity Fund had awarded its first round of scholarships, and recipients were beginning training programs across the country. One recipient, Jamal Peterson, shared in a video update that he had always dreamed of becoming a pilot, but felt excluded by systemic barriers. Now, he was in flight school, receiving hands-on instruction and mentorship. Angela felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the effects of her advocacy were extending beyond the airline, shaping the next generation of aviation professionals. Luis Moreno continued to encounter situations that tested his judgment. On a late-night flight to Los Angeles, a dispute arose between a passenger and a crew member over seat selection. The passenger's frustration escalated, and several attendants froze. Luis intervened, calmly de-escalating the situation, explaining the policies without condescension, and ensuring the passenger felt acknowledged and respected. The crew member watched and absorbed the example. It was a small victory. But cumulative instances like this reinforced the cultural change Angela had championed. Catherine Hayes also witnessed the long-term effects on staff morale. Flight attendants, who had once dreaded working with certain colleagues, now collaborated respectfully. Discussions in pre-flight briefings included reflections on passenger interactions and strategies to prevent bias. The conversation had shifted from avoidance and defensiveness to accountability and proactive respect. Angela often reflected on the contrast between the day of Flight 482 and the present. That morning, the airline had been an institution that rewarded appearances, assumptions, and rank over human dignity. Now, months later, it was an organization actively dismantling those structural inequities. She knew, however, that vigilance was essential. Change could stagnate if not continuously reinforced. Robert Whitfield's growth was further illustrated when he voluntarily assisted Luis Moreno in a training exercise. During a mock scenario involving a difficult passenger, Whitfield modeled empathy and procedural correctness, encouraging attendants to step in confidently. Luis noticed the shift not just in behavior, but in mindset. Whitfield now genuinely understood the importance of moral courage and human-centered leadership. Angela's work also inspired internal audits. Independent evaluators were brought in to examine staff interactions and passenger experiences. The reports confirmed the positive trend, but also highlighted areas needing additional focus, such as unconscious bias in promotions and recognition. Angela worked closely with Eleanor Shaw to refine policies, ensuring that all staff, from junior attendants to executives, understood their role in maintaining a culture of equity. On the one-year anniversary of Flight 482, Sky Continental held a small internal ceremony recognizing staff contributions to the Dignity First program. Luis Moreno, Catherine Hayes, and several other attendants were publicly acknowledged for their courage and commitment. Robert Whitfield spoke candidly about his own failures and growth. Angela attended quietly, observing the genuine pride and sense of accountability among the staff. The industry began taking note. Other airlines sent delegations to observe Sky Continental's programs. Trade publications praised the airline's proactive approach, highlighting how dignity and equity were now integral to operational excellence. Angela's framework, once a moral imperative for a single incident, had become an influential model for systemic change across the sector. Angela continued to balance her judicial duties with consulting and mentorship, She received correspondence from passengers, students in the scholarship program, and airline staff, all expressing gratitude and reflecting on how the emphasis on respect and accountability had positively affected their lives. Angela realized that change, when thoughtfully applied, rippled far beyond its initial context. In private reflection, Angela considered the personal lessons embedded in the airline's transformation. Courage, humility, and persistence had proven to be as critical as policies and procedures. Small actions speaking up, verifying facts, refusing to accept bias collectively, transformed the organization and improved the experiences of countless passengers. She understood that systemic change required both structural reform and the cultivation of individual moral responsibility. Luis Moreno often encountered moments that reinforced these lessons. During one flight, a passenger complained about what he perceived as preferential seating. Luis calmly explained the policies and ensured the situation was resolved fairly. The passenger left satisfied, and the attendants involved gained confidence in applying the principles they had learned. These micro moments became the lifeblood of the airline's cultural transformation. Catherine Hayes observed similar impacts during her mentoring sessions. Junior attendants reported increased comfort in addressing passenger complaints, actively participating in workshops, and challenging bias when observed among peers. The Dignity First program was no longer theoretical. It had become an operational reality embedded in behavior, mindset, and organizational expectation. Angela often reflected on the larger implications of the transformation. The airline's experience illustrated a broader societal truth. Systemic bias could be disrupted when individuals in positions of influence leveraged their authority responsibly. Accountability, empathy, and proactive policy changes could create environments where dignity was consistently prioritized. The lessons were applicable far beyond aviation, relevant to any organization confronting inequities and structural discrimination. By the second year after Flight 482, Sky Continental's transformation had become both internally ingrained and externally visible. Passengers noticed the difference the moment they boarded. The warm greetings from crew members, the attentiveness without condescension, and the proactive engagement with travelers created a tangible sense of dignity. Passengers who had once felt invisible or undervalued began sharing their experiences publicly. Social media posts highlighted respectful interactions, empathetic conflict resolution, and efficient service, all under the banner of the Dignity First program. Angela Carter continued her judicial responsibilities but increasingly received invitations to speak at conferences, workshops, and panel discussions about systemic bias, organizational reform, and equity in professional spaces. She maintained a careful balance, choosing engagements that allowed her to influence policy and organizational culture without becoming a celebrity figure. Her keynote at the National Civil Rights Conference drew widespread attention, and excerpts were cited in academic publications exploring institutional bias. Luis Moreno thrived in his new role, overseeing the cabin culture program and mentoring crew members nationwide. His perspective as a former junior flight attendant who had witnessed bias firsthand made his guidance resonate. Luis emphasized practical strategies, recognizing subtle prejudice, addressing conflicts before they escalated, and ensuring that crew members had the support needed to act ethically without fear of retaliation. He shared real-life anecdotes from Flight 482 illustrating both mistakes and successes, making abstract principles tangible. Catherine Hayes expanded her mentoring initiatives. She began hosting quarterly workshops for flight attendants, inviting them to reflect on interactions, discuss scenarios, and role-play challenging situations. The goal was to cultivate moral courage alongside technical proficiency. Young attendants appreciated the environment where questions, doubts, and confessions were welcomed without judgment. She emphasized that maintaining dignity for passengers was inseparable from fostering a respectful and accountable culture among colleagues. Robert Whitfield, having completed his retraining and mentoring assignments, returned to command larger domestic routes with full confidence. His transformation was evident to all aboard his flights. Colleagues noted his consistent fairness, attentiveness, and deliberate efforts to ensure every passenger felt seen and respected. Whitfield also voluntarily participated in training modules as a mentor, candidly sharing his prior failures and lessons learned. This humility resonated with younger flight attendants, who often remarked that they learned more from his candid reflections than from formal instructions. The airline itself saw measurable success. Customer satisfaction scores increased across all demographics, particularly among minority passengers who had previously reported feeling marginalized. Financially, these improvements translated into increased loyalty, higher bookings, and a stronger public reputation. Media coverage shifted. Sky Continental was no longer framed in the context of Flight 482's scandal, but instead as a case study in proactive institutional reform. Trade publications highlighted the airline's comprehensive approach to equity, noting the combination of policy, training, and accountability measures that set a new industry benchmark. Angela continued to monitor the scholarship initiative she had championed. The Carter Aviation Equity Fund had now distributed over $7 million in scholarships to aspiring pilots, engineers, and aviation management students from historically underrepresented communities. Graduates of the program began to appear in airline cockpits, maintenance hangars, and corporate offices, demonstrating the tangible impact of the initiative. Each success story reinforced the principle that systemic change required investment in talent pipelines and equitable opportunities, not just immediate remediation. Luis Moreno's team also implemented a feedback loop for crew members. Attendants could anonymously submit observations about passenger interactions, biases in peer behavior, or procedural inconsistencies. Reports were reviewed by a cross-functional committee, ensuring accountability and timely resolution. The system not only caught incidents early but also cultivated a culture of transparency and shared responsibility. Crew members who might have previously stayed silent now felt empowered to act in alignment with the airline's values. Catherine Hayes documented her mentoring sessions and produced a handbook for new attendants. It included real-world examples, suggested interventions, and guidelines for ethical decision-making in high-pressure situations. Her work was recognized by airline leadership as a critical component in institutionalizing the cultural changes initiated after Flight 482. By codifying best practices, Catherine ensured that the lessons learned were preserved and scalable across all Sky Continental operations. Robert Whitfield's transformation also had a ripple effect on pilot training programs. He collaborated with instructors to integrate modules on empathy, bias recognition, and passenger dignity into the curriculum for cadet pilots. Trainees participated in simulations emphasizing conflict resolution, cultural sensitivity, and ethical decision-making. Whitfield's candid reflections on his past failures made the lessons compelling and credible, setting a new standard for aviation leadership development. Angela observed the cumulative impact of these efforts and recognized that structural change required both policies and people. While metrics and audits were essential, it was the human dimension, the moral courage, empathy, and accountability of individual crew members that ultimately transformed the passenger experience. She reflected on Flight 482 and realized that its significance extended far beyond the immediate incident. It had become a catalyst for cultural change, inspiring individuals to take responsibility and organizations to rethink entrenched practices. The public also became aware of the airline's progress. Major news outlets ran follow-up stories highlighting Sky Continental's successes in reducing discriminatory incidents, improving passenger satisfaction, and cultivating a diverse, inclusive workforce. Passengers shared testimonials about how the airline's culture had positively affected their travel experiences. One mother recounted how her teenage daughter, traveling alone for the first time, felt safe and respected, a stark contrast to previous experiences with other carriers. These narratives resonated widely, emphasizing the emotional and societal significance of equitable treatment. Sky Continental executives, including Martin Reynolds and Eleanor Shaw, noticed a marked shift in employee engagement. Staff turnover decreased, internal surveys showed higher satisfaction, and team dynamics improved significantly. The company's leadership recognized that sustained investment in human capital, grounded in ethical and equitable practices, was not only the right thing to do, but also essential to long-term operational success. Angela's continued involvement reinforced the importance of accountability at the highest levels. She maintained regular communications with Sky Continental's leadership, reviewing progress reports and providing guidance on complex personnel matters. Her perspective as both a federal judge and an advocate for systemic reform lent credibility and weight to the initiatives. By demonstrating consistency, transparency, and a commitment to justice, Angela helped ensure that the cultural changes would endure. Luis Moreno reflected on the personal growth he had experienced. The role had expanded his understanding of leadership, ethics, and the importance of moral courage. He frequently mentored younger crew members, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to speak up when they witnessed bias. The once junior attendant who had silently observed Flight 482 had become a central figure in cultivating an airline culture rooted in dignity and respect. Catherine Hayes, meanwhile, continued to mentor and inspire, emphasizing that the changes were not complete but ongoing. Her focus remained on fostering awareness, accountability, and empathy in every interaction. The legacy of Flight 482 was no longer about one incident of discrimination. It was about the daily choices individuals made to uphold dignity and fairness. Robert Whitfield's continued growth reinforced the principle that authority and respect were inseparable from humility and accountability. His mentorship, active participation in training, and candid acknowledgement of past failures demonstrated the potential for redemption and meaningful leadership transformation. Younger crew members often cited him as an example of how acknowledgement, reflection, and corrective action could redefine professional identity. By the end of the second year, the cumulative effect of these reforms was undeniable. Sky Continental had become an exemplar of proactive organizational reform, demonstrating that systemic inequities could be addressed through a combination of policy, education, accountability, and moral courage. The airline story became a reference point for other industries seeking to implement equitable practices and foster cultures of respect and inclusion. Angela Carter reflected privately on the journey. She recognized that true justice was not measured solely by legal victories or public recognition, but by the tangible, positive impact on people's lives. Flight 482, once a moment of indignity and injustice, had catalyzed a transformation benefiting thousands of passengers, crew members, and future aviation professionals. Her satisfaction lay in knowing that the efforts she inspired would ripple far beyond a single incident, shaping a culture of dignity, respect, and equity for years to come. News of Sky Continental's transformation rippled across the airline industry. Competing carriers took notice, and within months, several had launched their own initiatives inspired by the Dignity First program. Airlines began revising training protocols, implementing anonymous reporting systems, and establishing oversight committees to ensure equitable treatment of passengers. Industry conferences featured panels where executives from Sky Continental shared insights and best practices, creating a sense of accountability and aspirational standards across the sector. Angela Carter continued her dual role as federal judge and public advocate for systemic equity. She often reflected on the delicate balance of power and responsibility that her position entailed. The Flight 482 incident had been an inflection point, revealing not only the pervasiveness of bias in professional environments, but also the potential for individual action to catalyze broad cultural change. For her, the satisfaction was less about recognition and more about witnessing concrete, positive outcomes in people's lives. Luis Moreno had emerged as a prominent voice within the airline, not just for his official role, but for the authenticity he brought to conversations about ethics and respect. He conducted workshops that emphasized active listening, recognizing microaggressions, and stepping in to prevent harm even when it was uncomfortable. Crew members frequently remarked that Luis's candid storytelling made abstract concepts real, turning training sessions into interactive experiences that resonated deeply. Catherine Hayes maintained a focus on mentorship and reflection. Her sessions often involved scenario-based exercises that placed attendants in ethically complex situations. One session, for example, asked attendants to navigate a simulated confrontation in first class where a passenger challenged their authority in a discriminatory manner. Participants explored how assumptions, biases, and procedural pressures influenced behavior. Catherine emphasized self-awareness and empathy as the tools to navigate these challenges, ensuring that decisions reinforce dignity and respect for all passengers. Robert Whitfield had gradually regained full command responsibilities, but approached each flight with renewed mindfulness. He often spoke privately with cadets and junior pilots about the moral dimensions of leadership. He stressed that technical proficiency alone did not define a pilot. True leadership encompassed integrity, fairness, and the courage to intervene when necessary. Whitfield's transparency about his prior failures became a cornerstone of training culture, demonstrating that acknowledgement and accountability were powerful instruments for institutional reform. Angela Carter's scholarship initiative continued to flourish. Recipients of the Carter Aviation Equity Fund often shared their stories with her, highlighting how the scholarships enabled them to pursue careers that would have otherwise been inaccessible. Pilots, engineers, and aviation management students from diverse backgrounds entered the industry, bringing fresh perspectives and reinforcing a culture that valued equity and inclusion. These personal connections served as a living testament to the enduring impact of Flight 482 and the principles she championed. Sky Continental's internal culture also deepened. Crew members no longer saw reporting bias as punitive, but as an integral part of upholding the airline's values. Anonymous submissions revealed patterns of behavior that had previously gone unnoticed, allowing the airline to address systemic issues before they escalated. Team dynamics improved as attendants recognized that accountability was a shared responsibility, fostering mutual trust and respect. Morale rose, and employees expressed a renewed sense of purpose in their work. Industry recognition followed. Sky Continental received awards for workplace culture, passenger satisfaction, and ethical leadership. Trade publications highlighted the airline's innovative approach, emphasizing the integration of ethics into operational practices. Competitors were inspired to follow suit, gradually transforming industry norms and expectations. Media coverage shifted focus from past scandals to the airline's ongoing commitment to cultural excellence, highlighting real stories of passengers and crew who had benefited from the reforms. Angela often reflected privately on the broader implications of Flight 482. Beyond airline operations, She saw parallels in other industries where entrenched hierarchies and implicit biases hindered equity and inclusion. Her experience became a framework for consulting and advising organizations, emphasizing the importance of structural change, transparent reporting, and human-centered training programs. These efforts reinforced her belief that systemic inequities could be mitigated through deliberate, principled action. Luis Moreno observed the ripple effects in day-to-day operations. Crew members who had previously felt powerless began stepping forward in difficult situations. One junior attendant, for instance, successfully mediated a tense interaction between a passenger and a colleague, drawing on lessons from the Dignity First program. Luis recognized that these small interventions cumulatively shifted the airline's culture, embedding respect and fairness into routine operations. Catherine Hayes's mentorship extended beyond the airline. She participated in educational initiatives, bringing her expertise to aviation schools and professional training programs. Her focus remained on ethical decision-making, moral courage, and fostering environments where every individual felt valued. By sharing practical strategies and lived experiences, Catherine helped ensure that the lessons of Flight 482 reached a wider audience, influencing industry standards and cultural expectations. Robert Whitfield integrated his personal reflection into professional development. He maintained detailed logs of interactions where bias or procedural lapses occurred, using these records as case studies for training sessions. By modeling continuous learning and accountability, Whitfield inspired colleagues to embrace growth, humility, and proactive problem-solving. His story became a powerful narrative within the airline, illustrating that professional authority is inseparable from ethical conduct. Angela Carter continued to monitor and evaluate the impact of the Dignity First program. She convened periodic meetings with leadership to review performance metrics, assess the efficacy of training initiatives, and identify areas for improvement. These sessions emphasized data-driven insights, combined with qualitative feedback from passengers and crew, ensuring a comprehensive understanding of the airline's cultural landscape. Luis Moreno's role evolved further as he developed advanced training modules incorporating virtual reality simulations and interactive exercises. Crew members experienced realistic scenarios designed to challenge assumptions, highlight implicit biases, and develop intervention strategies. These immersive experiences reinforced learning, making theoretical principles tangible and actionable. Catherine Hayes focused on reinforcing mentorship structures. Experienced attendants were paired with newer colleagues, creating networks of guidance, feedback, and shared accountability. This system encouraged knowledge transfer, reinforced ethical standards, and ensured that cultural change was not dependent on isolated individuals, but embedded across teams. Robert Whitfield's transparency with trainees fostered an environment where mistakes were opportunities for learning rather than occasions for punishment. By openly discussing prior errors, he demonstrated that ethical growth requires acknowledgement, reflection, and action. This approach cultivated resilience, humility, and a commitment to upholding dignity in every passenger interaction. Angela Carter continued to see the impact in tangible ways. Passengers who had experienced prior indignities reported positive interactions with crew, expressing gratitude for respectful treatment. Graduates of the Carter Aviation Equity Fund were succeeding in various roles, demonstrating that investment in equitable opportunities yielded measurable results. The legacy of Flight 482 extended beyond a single incident. It had become a blueprint for sustainable cultural transformation. The airline industry took notice. Sky Continental's model influenced policies, training, and leadership development across multiple carriers. The emphasis on dignity, ethical accountability, and proactive intervention became a benchmark, inspiring a generation of aviation professionals to embrace equity as a core operational value. Angela reflected on the journey, recognizing that true change requires persistence, patience, and the courage to challenge entrenched norms. Flight 482 had revealed vulnerabilities, but it had also created opportunities for systemic improvement. By addressing both individual behavior and organizational structures, she had helped transform an industry, proving that meaningful, lasting reform is possible when guided by principle, empathy, and moral courage. Months after the Flight 482 incident, Angela Carter's schedule remained demanding. Court sessions, advisory meetings, and speaking engagements filled her calendar. But she carried a quiet satisfaction. Each time she received updates on the airline's programs, she felt the tangible effects of her intervention. The Dignity First program had grown beyond her expectations, influencing decisions not only in aviation, but across other sectors struggling with systemic inequities. Luis Moreno, now firmly established as the head of Sky Continental's Office of Passenger Dignity and Rights, thrived in his new role. He approached his work with passion, frequently drawing from his own experiences on Flight 482 to illustrate the importance of integrity and vigilance. Crew members frequently approached him with questions or dilemmas, and Luis offered guidance grounded in both empathy and practical application. His efforts ensured that ethical behavior became normalized, not enforced an enduring shift in corporate culture. Catherine Hayes took on an even more prominent mentoring role. She designed advanced workshops for senior crew and management, using real-life incidents to illustrate challenges and solutions. One particularly impactful exercise involved role-playing scenarios where crew members faced subtle biases from passengers and colleagues alike. Participants were encouraged to reflect on their assumptions and develop strategies to uphold dignity while maintaining operational efficiency. Catherine's approach emphasized humility, vigilance, and moral courage, transforming abstract principles into actionable practices. Robert Whitfield, who had returned to the cockpit as a first officer on domestic routes, continued to integrate his personal growth into professional practice. He shared candid accounts of his prior mistakes during training sessions, emphasizing the consequences of inaction and the importance of confronting personal biases. Whitfield's transparency encouraged other pilots to self-reflect and take responsibility for ensuring equitable treatment. His story became a cautionary tale, but also a source of inspiration, demonstrating that leadership is defined by moral accountability as much as technical expertise. Angela Carter frequently reflected on the long-term impact of the scholarship fund she had established. Recipients of the Carter Aviation Equity Fund regularly reached out to share successes graduates had earned pilot licenses, advanced in aviation management, and contributed to more inclusive work environments. These personal stories reinforce the value of investing in opportunity rather than temporary recompense. Angela understood that systemic change required nurturing the next generation of leaders who could sustain ethical progress. The airline industry continued to evolve. Sky Continental's initiatives served as a benchmark for best practices, influencing competitors to adopt similar programs. Industry publications highlighted the airline's accomplishments, focusing not on sensationalism, but on substantive cultural transformation. Media narratives shifted from scandal to recognition of proactive leadership and ethical innovation. By setting a visible example, Angela Carter's intervention had helped recalibrate industry standards, demonstrating that accountability and equity are not mutually exclusive with profitability. Luis Moreno implemented advanced training modules incorporating virtual simulations designed to replicate high-pressure scenarios with potential bias or conflict. Crew members were immersed in challenging environments where they had to make immediate ethical decisions, developing skills to recognize and interrupt discriminatory behavior in real time. Feedback loops allowed participants to reflect on their actions, enhancing self-awareness and reinforcing ethical norms. Catherine Hayes expanded mentorship to include cross-departmental initiatives. Senior attendants were paired with new recruits to foster dialogue, share experiences, and establish mutual accountability. The initiative ensured continuity of values and ethical practices, embedding a culture of respect across operational hierarchies. Catherine emphasized that mentorship was not just about skill acquisition, but about reinforcing integrity, compassion, and vigilance against bias. Robert Whitfield's dedication to transparency continued to resonate within the airline. He documented ethical challenges encountered during flights and used these cases for internal workshops. By demonstrating vulnerability and admitting prior oversights, he cultivated an environment where open discussion was encouraged. Mistakes were reframed as learning opportunities, and proactive intervention became a collective responsibility. Angela Carter maintained oversight of the Dignity First program's metrics. Quarterly evaluations combined quantitative data, such as passenger complaint reduction and employee engagement, with qualitative feedback, capturing narratives of personal experiences. This comprehensive analysis ensured accountability and allowed continuous improvement, reinforcing that systemic change required both measurable outcomes and lived experiences. Luis Moreno observed the profound changes among crew. Attendants, who had once hesitated to intervene, now actively engaged in resolving situations that could escalate into discriminatory incidents. Small, daily interventions created a culture of collective responsibility, reinforcing the airline's commitment to respect and equity. Each positive interaction became a story to share, amplifying the program's reach and impact. Catherine Hayes' workshops highlighted real-world dilemmas. One session involved a situation where a senior passenger challenged a crew member's authority using subtle racial or gendered assumptions. Participants analyzed the interaction, discussed alternatives, and practiced responding in ways that maintained dignity and operational effectiveness. These exercises reinforced that ethical decision-making required awareness, courage, and strategic communication. Robert Whitfield integrated lessons from Flight 482 into professional development materials for pilots. His contributions emphasized moral courage, recognizing implicit biases, and understanding the ripple effects of decisions on passengers and crew. By modeling accountability and ethical leadership, he influenced a generation of pilots to approach their responsibilities with a more holistic understanding of duty. Angela Carter reflected on the broader societal implications of her actions. The Flight 482 incident demonstrated that individual agency, when combined with strategic leverage, could catalyze systemic change. Beyond airlines, she saw potential applications in other hierarchical institutions where implicit bias and entrenched norms limited opportunities and equity. Her experience became a model for ethical leadership, illustrating how courage, preparation, and principled action could transform organizations. Luis Moreno witnessed crew members embracing empowerment. Flight attendants who had previously felt constrained by authority structures began advocating for passengers, addressing subtle biases, and ensuring equitable treatment. Their actions, grounded in empathy and awareness, reinforced the airline's evolving culture, demonstrating that ethical norms could permeate operational routines effectively. Catherine Hayes' mentorship programs fostered resilience and adaptability. Crew members learned to navigate complex social dynamics without compromising dignity or operational efficiency. The structured guidance and shared accountability promoted confidence, reinforced ethical standards, and cultivated a sense of shared purpose across the workforce. Robert Whitfield continued to emphasize reflective practice among pilots. By documenting ethical challenges, discussing them in workshops, and sharing personal lessons learned, he helped normalize accountability and continuous improvement. Pilots began to see ethical conduct not as an adjunct responsibility, but as central to their professional identity, integrating moral vigilance into everyday operations. Angela Carter observed the cumulative effect of these efforts. The airline's transformation extended beyond policy and procedure. It reshaped behaviors, expectations, and cultural norms. Passengers reported increased satisfaction. Crew members expressed renewed pride, and the organization became recognized as a leader in ethical aviation. Flight 482 had sparked a chain reaction of change that persisted far beyond a single incident, demonstrating the power of principled action to create enduring positive impact. By the third year after Flight 482, the story had become something larger than any single airline, program, or policy. It was now remembered as a turning point, a narrative of injustice confronted and transformed into a legacy of dignity and reform. Yet, for Angela Carter, the significance of those events was never about industry accolades or institutional recognition. It was about people, ordinary passengers, crew members, and aspiring professionals whose lives were touched by the insistence that respect must never be negotiable. Angela often received handwritten letters from passengers. Some shared stories of past indignities, moments when they had been judged by their appearance, their accent, or their clothing. Others described new experiences with Sky Continental, how crew members went out of their way to ensure they felt valued, how the atmosphere on board was palpably different. These letters carried both gratitude and validation, affirming that the cultural transformation was not abstract but deeply human. Luis Moreno continued to expand his efforts, focusing not only on training but also on the emotional resilience of crew members. He introduced reflective circle spaces where attendants could share their fears, regrets, and triumphs. In these sessions, stories emerged of an attendant who once froze when witnessing discrimination, but later found the courage to intervene, of another who overcame her own biases to treat passengers with compassion. Luis believed that acknowledging vulnerability was as important as enforcing accountability. True cultural change required healing as much as policy. Catherine Hayes had grown into a role she once never imagined for herself, that of a cultural steward. Her mentoring extended beyond technical scenarios to include conversations about empathy, humility, and personal responsibility. She encouraged attendants to see themselves not just as employees, but as guardians of dignity. In one memorable session, she told her trainees, "Your authority comes from how you treat people when no one else is watching." That line was repeated often in crew rooms, becoming almost a mantra. Robert Whitfield, now reinstated as a captain on long-haul international routes, lived with the memory of his failures. But rather than letting shame define him, he used it as fuel for transparency and growth. During a pre-flight briefing, he once told his crew, "I used to think authority meant never being questioned. Now I know real authority means protecting everyone on this plane, even when it's uncomfortable for me." His candor shifted the tone of those meetings, creating an environment where respect was prioritized alongside safety. Angela Carter's scholarship program flourished. Dozens of young people from underrepresented communities entered aviation careers each year. At one event, a young woman named Alicia, the daughter of immigrants, stood before an audience of donors and described her dream of becoming an aerospace engineer. With tears in her eyes, she said, "This scholarship didn't just pay for my education, it told me I belonged." Angela listened quietly, profoundly moved, reminded once again why she had chosen systemic change over personal compensation. Sky Continental continued to model the industry standard. Other carriers that had initially resisted reform began adopting similar practices, influenced both by the airline's success and by growing public demand for accountability. Conferences once dominated by financial forecasts now included panels on equity, cultural sensitivity, and the moral responsibilities of global travel. Angela's name was often invoked as the spark, though she herself declined the spotlight. She believed that the story's power lay not in her identity, but in the universal truth. It represented dignity is a right, not a privilege. Luis Moreno often thought back to the day on Flight 482 when he had hesitated to speak. That hesitation haunted him, but it also fueled his determination never to remain silent again. In his workshops, he told new recruits, "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's speaking up even when your voice shakes." His honesty made the lessons unforgettable, and many attendants credited Luis with giving them the confidence to act when confronted with injustice. Catherine Hayes, once defensive and rigid, now embodied the humility of someone who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths. She often admitted her own mistakes during mentoring sessions, emphasizing that change was possible for anyone willing to reflect and learn. "The hardest part," she said once, "is admitting that you could have done better. But once you accept that, you'll never stop trying to improve." Her authenticity inspired loyalty among her mentees, who saw in her both a cautionary tale and a beacon of growth. Robert Whitfield's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. From a captain who once upheld the status quo without question, he had become a leader who actively encouraged dissent and dialogue. He regularly debriefed with his crew after flights, asking, "Did anyone feel we could have handled a situation differently?" These conversations, once unthinkable in hierarchical flight culture, created an atmosphere of trust and mutual accountability. Whitfield's willingness to listen made him not only respected, but beloved by his teams. Angela Carter continued to weave her story into her judicial work. When presiding over cases involving civil rights, workplace discrimination, or systemic inequities, she drew on her lived experience to inform her perspective. While she remained impartial in rulings, her understanding of human dignity deepened the wisdom of her judgments. Colleagues often remarked that her decisions reflected not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of justice. The ripple effects extended far beyond aviation. Other industries began consulting with Angela, seeking advice on creating equitable systems and cultures. Hospitals, universities, and corporations invited her to share insights from the Flight 482 transformation. Each time, Angela emphasized the same core principles: accountability, transparency, empathy, and sustained commitment. "Change isn't a campaign," she told one audience. "It's a culture you choose to nurture every day." One evening, Angela boarded a Sky Continental flight to Boston for a judicial symposium. She was greeted by a diverse crew led by a black woman captain, supported by attendants who embodied confidence and compassion. As she settled into her seat, a young man approached her nervously. "Judge Carter," he asked. She nodded. "I just wanted to thank you. I'm in training to become a pilot because of the scholarship you started. Without it, I never would have had this chance." Angela smiled warmly, her eyes moist. "Then, make the most of it," she said softly. "Carry this forward for others." The young man nodded firmly, his gratitude evident. That moment encapsulated the essence of her legacy, not recognition for herself, but opportunity for others. Luis Moreno, Catherine Hayes, and Robert Whitfield each had their own paths of growth, but their stories intertwined in a shared narrative of accountability, humility, and transformation. Together, they embodied the enduring lesson of Flight 482 that even in moments of injustice and failure, there exists the possibility for redemption, growth, and profound cultural change. As the flight took off, Angela gazed out the window, reflecting on the journey. From the indignity of being questioned for her rightful seat to the profound ripple effects across an entire industry, the arc of her story was one of resilience, courage, and hope. She understood that while systems could fail, individuals could rise. And when those individuals chose dignity over silence, fairness over comfort, and justice over expedience, they could reshape institutions and inspire generations. The story of Flight 482 was no longer hers alone. It belonged to every passenger who demanded respect, every crew member who chose courage, and every young dreamer who now saw a future in the skies. For Angela Carter, that was the true triumph, not just reclaiming her seat, but ensuring that countless others would never again be told. This seat isn't meant for people like you. By the 5th anniversary of Flight 482, the phrase, "the Carter Standard," had quietly entered the language of aviation. It was printed in training manuals, referenced in boardrooms, and whispered in crew lounges whenever a situation demanded courage. What began as one woman's painful humiliation had become a benchmark for dignity and accountability in the skies. Angela Carter herself avoided the spotlight. She never accepted speaking fees, never sought to monetize her experience. When interviewed, she redirected the focus to the programs and people who had carried the reforms forward. "This was never about me," she said once in a rare television appearance. "It's about the ordinary passengers who deserve extraordinary respect. It's about making sure no one has to fight for their place at 30,000 feet. Behind the scenes, however, Angela remained deeply involved. Each quarter, she convened a round table with Sky Continental executives, scholarship recipients, and civil rights advocates. These gatherings were less about checking boxes and more about listening, really listening to the voices of those still too often ignored. Angela believed that accountability lived not in glossy reports, but in the act of hearing stories that were raw, uncomfortable, and real. One such meeting included a passenger named Darren, a middle-aged father from Detroit. He had filed a complaint after being profiled during boarding, and the new accountability system ensured his voice reached the highest levels. Angela listened as he described the humiliation of being pulled aside in front of his children, of seeing the fear in their eyes as officers searched his bag for no reason. His voice cracked as he said, "I wasn't angry for myself. I was angry because my daughter thought it was normal." Angela leaned forward. "That's exactly why these systems matter," she told the executives in the room. "Because a little girl just learned what it means to feel less than. We can't let that be her inheritance." Luis Moreno, now head of the Office of Passenger Dignity and Rights, carried stories like Darren's into his policy work. He ensured each complaint was treated not as a data point, but as a human narrative with consequences. Under his leadership, the office launched Passenger Voices, a digital archive of anonymized testimonies. These accounts were used in training, ensuring that crew members confronted the lived reality of their decisions. Catherine Hayes often volunteered in these sessions. She read aloud from the archive, her voice steady, even as the words cut deep. He said, "I felt invisible, like I didn't belong on the plane I had paid to be on." She would pause, looking at the recruits. "That's what I did once. I made someone feel that small." Don't ever underestimate how lasting that wound can be. Her openness, once unimaginable, gave her credibility. She wasn't preaching perfection, she was modeling growth. Meanwhile, Captain Robert Whitfield became an industry speaker, ironically invited to share his journey from complicity to accountability. He resisted at first, uncomfortable with the attention, but Angela convinced him that honesty about failure could be as powerful as success. In front of young pilots, he spoke plainly. "I once lied to a passenger to protect a colleague's prejudice. I thought I was keeping the peace. But peace built on injustice isn't peace, It's cowardice. His words resonated, particularly with those just entering the profession, reminding them that authority carried moral weight. The scholarship program flourished beyond expectations. Partnering with universities and flight schools, it created pipelines not only for pilots, but also for engineers, mechanics, and administrators. The industry that once looked startlingly homogeneous now began to reflect the diversity of the passengers it served. Angela made a point of attending graduations, her presence both symbolic and deeply personal. When one graduate, Jamal, handed her his cap and said, "This belongs to you, too," she simply smiled, her heart heavy with gratitude. The wider public also felt the shift. Travel magazines began ranking airlines not only by amenities and on-time performance, but also by equity scores. Passengers noticed the difference crews intervening when bias surfaced, boarding processes that felt fairer, cabins where dignity was treated as non-negotiable. Hashtags like "Dignity First" trended not as outrage, but as celebration, capturing moments when ordinary people were treated with uncommon respect. Angela, however, remained wary of complacency. "The danger," she told Eleanor Shaw during one of their late-night calls, "is believing we've arrived. Equity isn't a destination. It's a daily decision." Shaw agreed, often reminding her teams that reform was a living practice, not a completed project. Outside aviation, Angela's story found unexpected resonance. Hospitals adopted dignity protocols for patient intake. Universities revised disciplinary systems to remove bias. Even tech companies studied the Carter reforms as a model for addressing inequities in algorithms. The ripple effects astonished Angela, though she never took credit. "If my story helps," she told a group of medical students, "it's because it points to something bigger than me. It points to the truth we all know, but too often ignore: respect saves lives." Yet for all the systemic change, the most profound impact often came in small, quiet moments. On one flight, Angela overheard a flight attendant politely but firmly correcting a colleague who had questioned a passenger's upgrade. The attendant said simply, "We don't do that anymore." It was 5 words, but to Angela, they carried the weight of years of struggle, heartbreak, and reform. She smiled, comforted by the knowledge that the culture shift had become self-sustaining. Still, Angela carried the memory of that humiliating day on Flight 482. It remained vivid, the disbelief in her chest, the cold sting of being told she didn't belong, the way the crew's authority pressed down on her like a weight. But instead of breaking her, it had sharpened her clarity. She understood now that personal pain could be alchemized into communal purpose. That was the true inheritance she hoped to leave, not bitterness, but transformation. On the evening of the 5th anniversary, Sky Continental held a commemorative event, not a celebration of scandal, but a recognition of change. Angela attended reluctantly, preferring quiet reflection. But when she saw the stage filled with scholarship graduates, diverse crews, and executives who had embraced reform, she felt a swell of something rare pride without vanity. Luis Moreno spoke first, recounting his journey from silence to leadership. Catherine Hayes followed, her voice firm as she described the humility required for growth. Robert Whitfield closed with a reflection on courage, his eyes moist as he said, "Flight 482 will never leave me. But I'm grateful because it taught me what it truly means to be responsible for lives, not just their safety, but their dignity." Finally, Angela was asked to speak. She stepped up, her charcoal gray suit and steady composure reminiscent of the day she first confronted the airline's leadership. The room hushed. She began softly, "I never wanted to be part of this story. I wanted to board a plane, take my seat, and be treated like everyone else. But life doesn't always give us the stories we choose. It gives us the stories we need." She paused, scanning the faces before her. The measure of an institution isn't whether it makes mistakes. It's whether it has the courage to face them, to change, and to grow. That courage doesn't live in policies. It lives in people like Luis, Catherine, Robert, and every one of you who has chosen to do better when no one is watching. Her voice grew stronger. This isn't my legacy. It's ours, and it's only just beginning. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Angela barely heard it. She was thinking of Darren's daughter, of Jamal's cap, of the attendant who said, "We don't do that anymore." She was thinking of all the lives quietly reshaped by one moment of humiliation turned into an enduring call for dignity. As she left the stage, Angela felt lighter, as though the burden she had carried since that fateful day had been shared with thousands of others. The story was no longer hers to hold alone. It belonged to everyone who believed that justice was not abstract, but lived in airports, in airplanes, in every seat where a human being deserved to be seen, respected, and valued. After the commemorative event, Angela Carter returned to her routine with the same deliberate pace she always carried. Yet she knew something had shifted. What began as a moment of humiliation on Flight 482 had transcended its origins, rippling far beyond aviation. The story now lived in classrooms, boardrooms, and even family dinner tables. People spoke of it not as a scandal, but as a lesson. Angela received an invitation to address a group of law students at Georgetown. She almost declined. Public speaking was never her ambition, but something in the request tugged at her. The students wanted to hear not just about the law, but about the lived experience of injustice standing before them. Angela recounted the events with her characteristic calm. "It was not the loss of a seat that wounded me," she told them. "It was the quiet certainty in their eyes that I did not belong. That certainty is more dangerous than any single act of bias, because it lives in the culture until someone dares to challenge it." The students were riveted. One young woman raised her hand. "How do you keep from being bitter?" she asked. Angela thought for a moment. "Bitterness is tempting," she admitted, "but bitterness narrows the world. Justice expands it. The challenge is to take pain and turn it outward not as poison, but as fuel for change." Her words spread beyond the lecture hall, quoted in legal blogs, and eventually in mainstream media. Once again, Angela found her story becoming part of a wider dialogue. She reminded herself that this was no longer about her. It was about a culture learning, slowly, how to heal. Meanwhile, Luis Moreno was spearheading a new initiative, the Courage Curriculum, a program adopted not only by Sky Continental, but also by several universities for their hospitality and business courses. It emphasized practical strategies for interrupting bias and fostered role-playing scenarios that mirrored real-life challenges. Luis traveled frequently, sharing his experiences with students who saw in him both vulnerability and resilience. "I froze once," he confessed openly, "and I'll live with that regret forever. But freezing doesn't have to define you. Speaking up can." His authenticity made him a sought-after speaker. At one campus, a student approached him afterward and said, "I saw my father humiliated in public once, and I stayed silent. You've shown me that silence doesn't have to be the end of the story." Luis carried those encounters like quiet victories, proof that the work mattered. Catherine Hayes, for her part, leaned into her new identity as a mentor. She began writing reflective essays, some of which were published in industry journals. In one, she admitted, "I once believed professionalism meant perfection. Now I know it means humility." Her willingness to name her failures gave her writing weight. Readers who might have dismissed corporate statements as hollow found themselves disarmed by her candor. She wasn't defending her past, she was dismantling it so others could learn. Robert Whitfield faced a different kind of audience. As one of the most experienced captains in the industry, he was asked to help design leadership training for new pilots. He spoke bluntly. Technical skill keeps the plane in the air. Moral clarity keeps the passengers safe in ways you can't measure with instruments. The cadets listened intently, many scribbling notes. Robert was no longer simply a pilot. He was a living parable of what happens when authority is exercised without reflection. Beyond aviation, corporations across sectors began citing the Carter Standard in their diversity and equity frameworks. A Fortune 500 CEO admitted publicly that his company had modeled its complaint resolution system on the Sky Continental reforms. Hospitals began rethinking patient intake protocols, schools revised disciplinary procedures, and even municipal governments studied the airline's dignity-first approach. The ripple effect was real, tangible, and wide-reaching. Angela, however, kept her focus grounded. For all the institutional progress, she knew that true change lived in the everyday interactions between human beings. She saw it on flights when crew members went out of their way to affirm passengers, when children of color were invited to the cockpit after landing, when travelers shared online about small acts of kindness that once felt unthinkable. Yet there were also reminders of how far the world still had to go. Angela sometimes read stories of discrimination in other industries, and her heart clenched with both anger and resolve. One evening, she wrote in her journal, "The sky is not yet safe for everyone, nor is the ground beneath it. But perhaps, in showing what is possible, we've made it harder for institutions to ignore the cost of doing nothing." At a reunion event for scholarship recipients, Angela found herself surrounded by young professionals whose careers had taken flight because of her insistence on systemic reform. One was a flight dispatcher, another a mechanical engineer. Several were pilots in training. They spoke with gratitude, but also with determination. "We're not just beneficiaries," one young man told her. "We're the next wave of guardians. We'll make sure the culture never slides backward." Angela listened, her eyes wet, struck by the continuity of the struggle. The press occasionally tried to crown her as a hero, but Angela resisted the narrative. "Heroes are rare," she said in an interview. "What matters is ordinary people choosing decency again and again. That's how cultures shift, not in grand gestures, but in countless small choices." Still, she could not deny the symbolic power of her story. On one flight, an elderly woman leaned over and whispered, "You're the judge from that flight, aren't you? My grandson is a pilot now because of your scholarship." Angela smiled gently. "Then he's the one who will carry it forward." Luis, Catherine, and Robert each carried their own burdens and triumphs, but their arcs had become intertwined with Angela's. Together, they embodied a truth both simple and profound: dignity denied to one is dignity denied to all. Their collective growth served as a reminder that justice is not an abstract principle, but a lived, daily practice. Angela often thought back to the moment when security saluted her on the jet bridge, exposing the cruel irony of her treatment. That gesture, though small, had crystallized the hypocrisy of the situation. Yet it also revealed something else: that respect, when shown, carried transformative power. The challenge was to make that power universal, not conditional on title or a uniform. As she prepared for another judicial conference, Angela paused at her window, watching a plane arc across the evening sky. She thought of the thousands of lives touched by a single moment of indignity that refused to be ignored. Pain had given way to purpose, humiliation to hope. The journey was unfinished, but it was underway. She closed her journal with a final line: "The seat I claimed was never just mine. It belongs to everyone who dares to insist they belong. Angela Carter's life settled into a rhythm that was, at least on the surface, ordinary. She presided over cases, drafted opinions, and maintained her quiet dignity in the courtroom. Yet beneath that routine pulsed the undeniable current of the Carter Standard, a reform that had taken on a life of its own. Each month, new reports reached her desk not because she asked for them, but because people felt compelled to share. A nurse in Denver wrote about how her hospital restructured its intake process after studying Sky Continental's reforms. A university dean described changes in admissions policies. Even a mid-sized trucking company announced the creation of a Dignity First task force. Angela read these accounts with a sense of awe. What began on Flight 482 had rippled outward in ways she could never have orchestrated. Still, the personal remained just as powerful as the systemic. On one quiet afternoon, she received a letter from a boy named Elijah, the son of a scholarship recipient. "My mom is learning to fix airplanes," he wrote in blocky handwriting. "She says one day she'll fix the one that takes me to Disney World. Thank you for making her dream real." Angela folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer where she kept the most meaningful mementos. These were the reminders that change was not abstract. It had a child's handwriting, a family's hope, a life transformed. Luis Moreno continued to lead his office with unrelenting passion. His Courage curriculum expanded internationally, adopted by carriers in Europe, South America, and Asia. He traveled frequently, often exhausted, but driven by conviction. In quiet moments, he still remembered the silence he carried on Flight 482. It haunted him, yes, but it also propelled him. At a conference in Madrid, he told the audience, "My silence once cost someone her dignity. Now my voice is committed to protecting it, everywhere I can." The applause was long and heartfelt, but Luis carried the weight not as glory, but as duty. Catherine Hayes found herself in demand as a writer and speaker. Her essays were compiled into a slim volume titled Lessons at 30,000 Feet, which became a surprise bestseller in professional development circles. She never glamorized her role. Instead, she wrote candidly of the shame she had felt, the stubbornness she had to dismantle, and the humility she now embraced daily. In one chapter, she wrote, "Growth is not the absence of failure. It is the decision to face failure without flinching and to walk forward anyway." Readers across industries found her words resonant, proof that vulnerability could be strength. Robert Whitfield, meanwhile, had become something of an elder statesman in aviation. Though he still flew, much of his time was spent mentoring younger pilots. He was frank about his past, refusing to sugarcoat his mistakes. Authority, he told one group of cadets, is like an instrument panel. It gives you information, but it doesn't make decisions for you. Your humanity does that. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. His mentorship extended beyond the technical to the moral, shaping a generation of pilots who would carry forward not just his skill, but his lessons in accountability. Angela herself remained the quiet anchor of the movement. She accepted her role not as a leader in the traditional sense, but as a custodian of a story that belonged to many. She often declined awards, insisting that the real recognition belonged to the crews, passengers, and students who lived the reforms daily. Yet her influence was undeniable. Judges across the country cited her case study in rulings on discrimination, and her name was invoked in boardrooms as shorthand for courage. One evening, after a long day in court, Angela boarded a Sky Continental flight to Los Angeles. She found herself seated beside a young woman, nervously clutching a binder of notes. They exchanged polite greetings, and soon the woman confided that she was preparing for a job interview in aviation management. "I'm nervous," she admitted. I'm the first in my family to even graduate college." Angela listened, then said gently, "Remember this, your presence in that room is already proof you belong. The interview is not about whether you're worthy, it's about whether they recognize what you already carry." The young woman blinked, visibly moved. Hours later, as they parted ways, she whispered, "Thank you. I'll remember that." Angela walked away quietly, knowing she had simply offered what she herself had once needed, affirmation of belonging. The Carter Standard soon found its way into unexpected places. High school debate teams referenced it in arguments about systemic reform. Church sermons used it as a metaphor for grace and accountability. Even television dramas wove fictionalized versions of Flight 482 into storylines, bringing its lessons to wider audiences. Angela never watched these depictions, but she understood their purpose. The story had become archetypal, a modern parable of humiliation, revelation, and transformation. Despite the global recognition, Angela remained deeply human, wrestling with private doubts. There were nights she questioned whether the burden was worth it, whether the constant retelling of her pain reopened wounds rather than healed them. In those moments, she returned to her journal. "Dignity is not a gift we give," she wrote once. "It is the truth we either honor or betray, and every betrayal leaves a scar." Her scars, she knew, would never vanish, but she had chosen to let them guide rather than harden her. That choice, she realized, was the essence of resilience. 5 years after Flight 482, Sky Continental held a graduation ceremony for its largest cohort of scholarship recipients. Angela attended quietly, seated in the back row. As names were called and diplomas handed out, she felt a swell of pride she could not contain. When one graduate took the microphone and said, "I'm here because someone turned humiliation into hope," the room erupted in applause. Angela bowed her head, tears gathering in her eyes. She had no need for recognition. The impact was already alive in every life transformed. As the ceremony ended, a young boy approached her shyly. "Are you Judge Carter?" he asked. She nodded. "My mom's a pilot now," he said proudly. "She told me to tell you thank you." Angela knelt to his height, smiled warmly, and replied, "Then one day, you thank her too, because she carried the dream forward." That night, flying home, Angela looked out at the endless stretch of sky. She thought about the long horizon, how justice, like flight, was never static, but always in motion. The work would never be finished. There would always be new challenges, new injustices, new voices demanding to be heard. But she also knew that the culture had shifted in ways that could not be undone. A standard had been set. As the plane leveled at cruising altitude, she closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "The seat was never just mine. It belongs to everyone who dares to sit with dignity." The 10th anniversary of Flight 482 arrived with quiet inevitability. To Angela Carter, the date was not something to celebrate, but something to honor. It marked a wound, but also a turning point, proof that indignity, when confronted with courage, could yield transformation. Sky Continental marked the milestone with a modest ceremony at its Chicago headquarters. The company had grown into a model of equity, its training programs now studied across industries, its scholarship fund having launched more than 300 careers in aviation and beyond. Angela accepted the invitation, though reluctantly. She preferred her work in the courtroom, where justice was rendered not in headlines but in carefully crafted words on a page. Yet she knew that presence mattered. When she entered the atrium, she was greeted by applause that felt both overwhelming and undeserved. Faces young and old turned toward her: pilots, attendants, engineers, executives, and scholarship recipients who carried the Carter Standard in their work and their lives. Angela gave a small nod, her expression calm, but her chest heavy with emotion. Luis Moreno spoke first, standing behind the podium with the ease of someone who had grown into his authority. 10 years ago, I was a junior attendant afraid to speak, he told the audience. Now I lead an office dedicated to ensuring no one ever has to feel that fear again. Judge Carter taught us that silence is never neutral, it is complicity. And because of her, we found our voices. The crowd erupted in applause, and Angela, seated in the front row, felt both pride and humility. Next came Catherine Hayes. She held a slim book in her hand, her own collection of essays that had reached audiences far beyond aviation. I was once part of the problem, she admitted openly. But this standard, this expectation of dignity gave me a path toward becoming part of the solution. Growth is possible, even after failure. That's the lesson I carry, and the lesson I try to pass on. Robert Whitfield followed, his once commanding voice softened by age, but carrying even more weight for its sincerity. I lied once to protect prejudice, he said plainly. I betrayed the authority entrusted to me. But I've spent every year since choosing honesty, even when it's hard. Judge Carter reminded us that leadership is not about power, it's about accountability. I will carry that until my last flight. Finally, Angela was asked to speak. She approached the podium slowly, her familiar charcoal gray suit and pearl necklace symbols of the dignity she had always carried. She looked out at the sea of faces and felt the silence of expectation settle over the room. I have been called many things over the last decade, she began. A survivor, a reformer, a symbol. But in truth, I am simply a woman who boarded a plane one day expecting dignity and was denied it. What followed was not my doing alone. It was the courage of many Luis, Catherine, Robert, and countless others who chose to change the story. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. The Carter Standard is not mine to own. It belongs to all of you. It lives every time a crew member chooses fairness over convenience, every time a manager listens instead of dismisses, every time a passenger is treated not as a problem to be managed, but as a person to be respected. That is the legacy, and it is still being written. Her words landed with quiet power. The applause that followed was heartfelt but restrained, as though the audience understood that reverence mattered more than volume. Angela stepped down, relieved to return to the quiet anonymity she preferred. That evening, she dined with scholarship alumni. They shared stories of their journeys. Some had become pilots, others engineers, still others leaders in entirely different industries. One young woman named Jasmine told Angela, "I was a child when Flight 482 happened. I remember seeing you on the news and thinking, if she can stand up for herself, maybe one day I can too. Now I'm a captain. Because you stood your ground, I found mine." Angela listened, humbled, reminded once again that the real impact of her ordeal was not in her own vindication, but in the lives it inspired. Yet even amid the celebration, Angela remained keenly aware of the work still undone. Reports of discrimination in other sectors reached her regularly. She read them with a mix of anger and resolve. The Carter Standard had spread far, but inequity was stubborn, reappearing in new forms wherever power and prejudice intersected. Angela knew the fight was not over. It never would be. One night, unable to sleep, she returned to her journal. She wrote, "Justice is never a destination. It is a horizon we walk toward, step by step. The only failure is to stop walking." Luis, Catherine, And Robert continued their work as well. Luis expanded the Courage curriculum into a global initiative, teaching not only flight crews, but also law enforcement, educators, and medical staff. Catherine's essays were now studied in leadership programs, her vulnerability a model for reflective growth. Robert, nearing retirement, continued to mentor, telling cadets, "Your legacy is not the flights you complete, but the lives you respect along the way." Angela found herself at peace with their arcs. They had each taken their share of the burden and transformed it into something constructive. That, she realized, was the truest measure of redemption, not erasing the past, but reshaping it into a foundation for better futures. 10 years on, Flight 482 was no longer remembered as a scandal, but as a story of transformation. It had become a parable retold in classrooms, a case study in boardrooms, and a reminder in everyday life that dignity could never be optional. Angela Carter carried the memory still, but not as a wound. It had become something else, a compass. On her next flight, a routine trip to Washington, D.C., she was greeted by a young attendant who smiled warmly and said, "Welcome aboard, Judge Carter. It's an honor." She thanked him politely, then settled into her seat. As the plane climbed into the sky, she gazed out the window and thought of the horizon. The sky, she knew, was vast and imperfect, but it was also shared, and in that shared space, there was always room for dignity. The years that followed the 10th anniversary unfolded with both predictability and surprise. For Angela Carter, life was still rooted in the steady cadence of judicial work. Her courtroom was her sanctuary, a place where words carried weight and justice was not a slogan, but a painstaking process. Yet, no matter how many cases she presided over, people continued to associate her name with a single story, Flight 482. She sometimes felt ambivalent about that association. On one hand, she understood the symbolic power of the incident. It had sparked reforms, inspired lives, and set a benchmark across industries. On the other hand, Angela knew that her identity was larger than a single event. She was a jurist, a scholar, a daughter, a mentor, a woman who loved quiet evenings with a book by the window. But she had long ago accepted that she could not control how history remembered her. She could only control how she carried herself in the present. One morning, while preparing an opinion for a civil rights case, Angela received an email from a young attorney. The message was simple. "I am arguing my first case today. I wanted you to know that I became a lawyer because I read about you in law school. You taught me that dignity is the foundation of justice." Angela leaned back in her chair, absorbing the weight of those words. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "That's the measure." Luis Moreno was thriving in his role as a global trainer, but the demands were unrelenting. He had become a figurehead for the Carter Standard abroad, invited to governments and NGOs that sought to replicate the airline's dignity-first model. Yet beneath the recognition was a man still reckoning with his own silence years ago. On a late-night call with Angela, he confessed, "Sometimes I feel like an imposter. They look at me as if I've always been brave. But the truth is, I wasn't. I failed you that day." Angela's response was gentle but firm. "Luis, courage isn't a permanent state. It's a choice you make again and again. You froze once, yes, but every day since, you've chosen differently. That's what defines you." Her words steadied him. The guilt never fully vanished, but it no longer paralyzed him. Instead, it became a reminder of why the work mattered so deeply. Catherine Hayes had taken her mentorship in a new direction. Beyond aviation, she began consulting for corporations, grappling with cultural change. Her honesty about her own failings gave her credibility in rooms where polished executives often resisted uncomfortable truths. In one session with a finance firm, a manager challenged her. "Why should we listen to you? You were part of the problem." Catherine didn't flinch. "Exactly. And because I was part of the problem, I know how easy it is to justify bias as procedure. I also know how possible it is to unlearn it. If I can change, so can you." The room was silent. Then, slowly, nods spread across the table. Her vulnerability had disarmed their defensiveness. Robert Whitfield was nearing the end of his career. Retirement loomed, and with it, the inevitable question of legacy. He continued to mentor young pilots, but his reflections had grown more personal. "Over coffee with Angela one afternoon," he admitted, "I wonder if people will remember me only for my failure." Angela stirred her tea before replying. "Failure doesn't erase a life's work. Robert, it shapes it. What matters is what you did after. You didn't run from it, you faced it. That's rarer than you think." Robert looked down, humbled. "You always know how to say the thing that keeps me moving," he murmured. Together, the four of them, Angela, Louise, Catherine, and Robert, remained unlikely companions, bound by a shared story that had changed each of their lives in different ways. Their paths often diverged, yet the connection endured, a reminder that legacies are never carried alone. Beyond their circle, the Carter Standard continued to spread. Universities built coursework around it. Civil rights groups used it as a template for advocacy. Even tech companies studying algorithmic bias cited the airline reforms as an example of how systemic change could be pursued. The phrase dignity first had become part of the vernacular, a shorthand for fairness in spaces far removed from aviation. Still, Angela knew the work was fragile. At a symposium in New York, she was asked whether the progress could ever be undone. Her answer was candid. Of course it can. Injustice is resilient. Bias adapts. The only way progress lasts is if people choose it every day. The Carter Standard is not a shield. It's a mirror. It shows us who we are willing to be. Her honesty drew a standing ovation. Yet, more than applause, it sparked conversations that continued long after she left the stage. The story of Flight 482 had become more than a parable of humiliation and justice. It was now a test of character for anyone who heard it. People asked themselves, would I have spoken up like Louise eventually did? Would I have dismissed complaints like Robert once did? Would I have recognized bias in myself, as Catherine eventually had to? And most importantly, what choice would I make in my own life when dignity was on the line? Angela often reflected on these ripples. She did not see herself as extraordinary. She saw herself as someone who had been forced into a moment she could not ignore. Anyone could have been me. She once told a group of students, "The real question is, when it happens to you, when the world tells you that you don't belong, what will you do with that moment one autumn evening?" Angela boarded another Sky Continental flight, this time to San Francisco. The crew welcomed her warmly, but not with fanfare. They simply treated her as they did every passenger, with quiet respect. For Angela, that was the true victory. As the plane climbed into the twilight, she gazed at the horizon and thought of all the lives touched by one painful moment that had been transformed into a movement. She did not need monuments or accolades. The measure of her legacy was already written in the countless small interactions happening every day, in airports, in airplanes, in workplaces where dignity was chosen over disregard. Angela closed her eyes. Content, the human measure, she realized, was not in titles or history books. It was in the ordinary kindness that told every person, without exception, you belong here. Winter in Washington had a way of cloaking the city in silence. Snow muffled the usual rush of traffic, leaving only the crunch of boots on sidewalks and the whistle of wind between buildings. Angela Carter often found these winters contemplative. From her office window in the courthouse, She watched flakes fall against the marble columns, thinking about time, how it passed, how it healed, how it tested. Her days were filled with the gravity of judicial work. Civil rights cases, discrimination suits, constitutional disputes. Each one a reminder that injustice was never abstract. It had names, faces, and wounds that demanded acknowledgement. Angela delivered her rulings with the same steady voice she had always carried, but in her private moments, she wondered how much weight one person could bear. The story of Flight 482 had granted her a kind of immortality she had not sought. Her name appeared in textbooks, her speeches were quoted by activists, and her decisions were scrutinized through the lens of that single event. Some days, she accepted it as a responsibility. Other days, she longed for anonymity. Yet each time she faced doubt, someone would remind her why she endured. That reminder came one morning in the form of a knock at her office door. It was a clerk delivering a package. Inside was a worn leather journal and a short note, Judge Carter. I wanted you to have this. My father was a passenger on Flight 482. He wrote about that day and about the dignity you carried. He passed last year, but he asked me to send this to you when I was ready. Thank you for showing him and me that justice is not just in courts, but in courage. Angela traced her fingers along the faded cover. Opening it, she found pages filled with observations about the tense silence before security arrived, about the way crew members fumbled between excuses and authority, about the moment Angela stood, calm and unyielding, as dignity was both denied and restored. Reading those words through another's eyes, she felt the weight of quiet courage, not just hers, but the collective courage of everyone who had chosen to act differently afterward. Luis Moreno felt that weight, too. His global work had expanded, but it came at a cost. Constant travel wore him down, and the burden of being seen as a symbol sometimes left him sleepless. On a flight to Toronto, he confided in a colleague, I don't want to be remembered for one mistake forever. I want to be remembered for what I built after. The colleague replied simply, Then keep building. Let your after speak louder than your before. Luis smiled faintly, grateful. It was the same wisdom Angela had offered him years ago, but hearing it from another voice reminded him that the standard had become larger than any one person. Catherine Hayes, meanwhile, continued to surprise herself. Consulting had taken her into industries she never imagined, tech, healthcare, even sports management. In every space, she carried the same message. Humility is not weakness, it is strength refined. In one memorable session with a group of executives, a young manager asked her, Do you ever regret staying in aviation after what happened? Catherine paused. I don't regret staying. I regret not seeing sooner. But staying gave me a chance to make it right. If I had walked away, the story would have ended in shame. By staying, I got to be part of the repair. Her words struck a chord. Many in the room later admitted that they had considered leaving their industries out of frustration with systemic bias. Catherine's testimony gave them a new perspective change, sometimes required presence more than departure. Robert Whitfield's health had begun to decline, but his spirit remained unbroken. Though he flew less frequently, he still mentored young pilots with the same candor as always. At his retirement ceremony, he spoke plainly, I once failed to uphold dignity in my cockpit. That failure could have defined me. Instead, it became the lesson I taught every pilot after. Don't fear your mistakes. Fear refusing to learn from them. The hall erupted in applause, not for perfection, but for the honesty of a man who had embraced accountability. Angela attended the ceremony quietly, seated in the back. She watched Robert receive his final salute and felt a swell of gratitude. They had all carried burdens, but they had also carried each other. That, she realized, was the essence of endurance, not solitary strength, but shared resilience. Beyond their personal journeys, the Carter Standard continued to ripple outward. A coalition of civil rights organizations announced a partnership with universities to integrate dignity-first practices into public administration programs. Law students debated its implications in moot courts. Even international forums referenced Flight 482 as a case study in systemic reform. Angela observed these developments with cautious hope. She knew progress was fragile. Every reform faced backlash. Every step forward encountered resistance. Yet she also knew that stories had power. And once told, stories could not be untold. One evening, after a long day, she attended a community forum at a local church. The gathering was informal folding chairs, coffee in styrofoam cups, a mix of residents, young and old. Angela was invited to share a few words, but she chose instead to listen. An older man stood and said, "I remember the day I saw the news about your flight. I thought, if even a judge can be treated that way, what hope do the rest of us have? But then I saw what you did after. And I thought, maybe that's the hope that someone fights back, not with anger, but with dignity." Angela's throat tightened. She hadn't planned to speak, but she rose quietly. "Dignity," she said, "isn't about titles or uniforms. It's about how we choose to see each other in every ordinary moment. If my story has done anything, I hope it's reminded us that belonging is not a privilege, it's a birthright." The room fell silent, then filled with murmurs of agreement. In that modest hall, Angela felt the truth she had carried for years. Justice was not confined to courtrooms or corporations. It lived in everyday interactions, in the quiet courage of people choosing decency when no one was watching. Later that night, writing in her journal, she reflected, "The measure of my life will not be what happened on Flight 482. It will be what I chose to do with it. The burden is heavy, yes, but so is the blessing." She closed the journal, looked out at the winter sky, and felt both the weight and the lightness of quiet courage. The following spring, Angela Carter was invited to keynote an international aviation summit in Seattle. The event brought together executives, regulators, activists, and scholars. For Angela, it was not just another speech, it was a test. Could the principles born out of Flight 482 stand in a room filled with people whose first loyalty was profit margins and competitive advantage? The convention center was a towering glass structure, sunlight spilling across banners that read, "Aviation Beyond Borders Building Trust. Building Tomorrow." Inside, the crowd buzzed with anticipation. Angela's name had drawn attendees from across the globe. Some came to support, some came to challenge, all came to listen. Before taking the stage, Angela sat in the green room with Eleanor Shaw, who had become both ally and confidant. Eleanor squeezed her hand gently. "They're expecting policy points. Give them something more. Give them the story they can't ignore." Angela nodded, adjusting her pearl earrings. She carried no notes. The story was written not on paper, but in her memory, etched by humiliation, defiance, and transformation. When she stepped onto the stage, the applause was respectful, restrained. She began simply, "3 years ago, I was denied my seat in first class, not because my ticket was invalid, but because someone decided I did not fit their picture of who belonged there." The audience leaned in. She continued, weaving the personal with the systemic. She spoke of Catherine Hayes, who had chosen to face her failures with humility. She spoke of Robert Whitfield, who had rebuilt his honor through mentorship. She spoke of Luis Moreno, who had carried the banner of dignity into every corner of the airline. "This is not a story about one flight or one airline," Angela said. "It is a story about every institution that chooses expedience over equity, silence over courage, convenience over justice." Her words rose and fell like a tide, steady and unrelenting. She did not shout, yet the room vibrated with intensity. At one point, she paused, letting silence hang. When passengers boarded Flight 482, they did not know they were stepping into history. Neither did I. But history does not wait for our permission. It records what we choose to do or not do when dignity is on trial. The hall erupted in applause. Even skeptics were drawn into the gravity of her voice. During the Q&A, a European airline executive asked pointedly, "Judge Carter, reforms cost money. Training, audits, scholarships, they add up. How do you justify these expenses in an industry already under financial strain?" Angela's response was calm, but cutting. "How do you justify the cost of lawsuits, lost trust, and reputational collapse? How do you measure the price of humiliation that drives customers away? The question is not whether equity is expensive. The question is whether prejudice is affordable." The executive had no reply. Afterward, as attendees mingled, journalists pressed in with microphones. Angela gave only brief statements, but one exchange stood out. A young black pilot trainee approached her, eyes wide. "Judge Carter, I'm in the scholarship program that bears your name. Next year, I'll graduate flight school. I just wanted to say because of you, I believe there's a place for me in that cockpit." Angela clasped his hand warmly. "You don't need my permission to belong," she said. "You already do." Backstage, Eleanor exhaled with visible relief. "You didn't just deliver a speech. You set the agenda. News outlets confirmed it. Headlines read, 'Carter challenges industry at summit. From passenger to pioneer. The cost of dignity versus the cost of prejudice.' Within weeks, several airlines announced new equity initiatives, citing the Carter standard as inspiration. For Angela, however, the triumph was tempered. She knew the danger of complacency. After the summit, she retreated to a quiet cafe near Pike Place Market. Over a cup of black coffee, she opened her journal. Victories are fragile. Progress is temporary unless guarded. The real test is not the applause of today, but the practice of tomorrow. Meanwhile, Luis Moreno carried the summit's momentum into his own work. Traveling to South America, he launched training sessions in Spanish and Portuguese, tailoring scenarios to cultural contexts while keeping the core principle intact: dignity first. On one flight to Bogota, he overheard a flight attendant intervene when a passenger questioned another seat with suspicion. "Senor, every passenger here deserves respect. Please take your seat." Luis felt pride swell in his chest. Change was not abstract. It was audible. Catherine Hayes, too, found herself in new territory. She was invited to write a memoir not about scandal, but about growth. Tentatively titled Grace After Error, it traced her journey from complicity to conviction. In her draft, she wrote, "I thought authority meant control. I learned authority means responsibility. The uniform gave me power, but only humility gave me purpose." Her editor called the manuscript a map for anyone seeking redemption. Catherine wasn't sure she deserved such praise, but she recognized the power of her story to reach others still trapped in denial. Robert Whitfield, though officially retired, was far from idle. He volunteered with a nonprofit that introduced aviation careers to underprivileged youth. During one session, a teenager asked, "Captain, what was your proudest flight?" Robert hesitated, then replied softly, "The one I lost." Confused looks followed. He explained, "It was the flight where I failed someone's dignity." That mistake became the lesson I carried for the rest of my career. My proudest flight wasn't smooth skies. It was the one that taught me to see. His honesty lingered in the young minds before him, planting seeds that might one day grow into pilots who valued dignity as much as safety. Back in Washington, Angela prepared for another case heavy with implications. This time it was about workplace discrimination in a major tech firm. The irony wasn't lost on her. Flight 482 had begun in an airplane, but its echoes now shaped boardrooms, classrooms, and courtrooms alike. On the evening before the trial, she received a message from Luis. "Everywhere I go, I hear your name, not as a title, but as a verb, they say. We need to charter this policy." "That's what you've become, a standard, a call to act." Angela smiled faintly. She wrote back, "Then we must make sure Carter means more than words. It must mean work." As snow fell again in Washington, Angela reflected on how far they had come, from humiliation at 35,000 feet to a summit shaping global policy, from isolation to community, from wounds to wisdom. Yet she also knew the journey was unfinished. The Carter Standard was not a monument, it was a compass. The story of Angela Carter reminds us that dignity is not a luxury, it is a right. What happened on Flight 482 was more than one woman being denied her seat. It was the echo of every moment when someone was judged by their appearance rather than their worth. Yet the lesson is not only in the injustice, it is in the response. Angela did not lash out. She stood calm, grounded in truth, and used her influence not for revenge, but for reform. For those of us watching, the takeaway is clear. We cannot always control how others treat us, but we can choose how we respond. Dignity, patience, and courage often speak louder than anger. And when one person chooses the higher ground, it creates space for systemic change that benefits everyone, whether in the workplace, community, or even at the family table. We are all faced with moments where bias, subtle or overt, tries to define the outcome. Angela's story challenges us to ask, will we allow it to continue? Or will we, in our own way, become agents of dignity? Thank you for spending your time with us today. Stories like this remind us that justice, respect, and courage truly matter. If this touched you, please like the video, share it with others who need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Together, let's keep these conversations alive and build a community where every voice belongs.